Why do good people do bad things? That's the question I want you to consider as we talk about this novel, Lord of the Flies, written by William Golding. It's the question that really inspired the plot for this story, and it's the question that Golding sought to answer, and it's the one that I think he was able to answer by the end. It's a very complex question, but it's an important one because I think nowadays, more than ever, we assume that we ourselves are purely good in a lot of ways, that we just would always make the right choice. But we know that that's not true. We know that we can't live a perfect life where we're never going to mess up and make a mistake and make the wrong choice, because we do from time to time. Some people make the wrong choice a lot more than others do. But still, we're all a combination of these two things, good and bad. No one's truly good, no one's truly bad. We're a combo of both. But William Golding wanted to answer that question. Why do good people do bad things? And part of the reason why he was so caught up in this question was because he served in World War II and saw a lot of atrocities committed. And as you know, during times of war, people do horrible things. And so when he returned, he began writing this book. And it was published in 1954 after World War II had, been completed and things were settling down. And, the Cold War was starting to pick up a little bit. He wrote this book and he put a lot of what he saw in World War II in this book. Not in the setting, not in the characters, but in the actions, in the themes. And so we're going to explore all that. Now, this book, like many books, was rejected by publishers many, many times until one finally picked it up and published it, and then it became a bestseller, and now it's considered on the Western canon, which basically means it's considered to be one of those books that's a must-read to really understand the progression of Western literature. But the reason why it was rejected, and this is why I'm bringing this up, because I find this sort of interesting, is that the publishers that rejected it claimed that it was too absurd and silly. This was one of the quotes that they had. They called it absurd, they called it silly, which is interesting to me because when you read this book, it's really written in a realistic fashion. It's not written in a way that you would read it and say, oh, wow, this is so different than, something else. This is a really strange way to tell a story. No, it's written in a very traditional sense. There are a few parts that kind of dip into the supernatural, but the prose itself is plain. And when I say plain, I don't mean boring or not complex. I mean, there are some parts in this book that are very beautifully written and include so much imagery and metaphors and similes and things. But when I say plain, I mean realistic. He's not trying to reinvent the wheel with his prose, I guess I should say. Now, something else that I'd like to bring up before really getting into the majority of this video, which is going to be the summary and the analysis, is that J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, he also served in war, World War I. And for him, he wanted to create a world to almost escape the harshness of our world. That's why he invented Middle-earth and, really popularized the fantasy genre. He was sort of trying to escape what he had seen. William Golding, invents the world of Lord of the Flies, not to escape from our reality, but really to portray it in a very realistic and shocking way. And like I said, although it does dip into the supernatural, it never gets to a point where it's unbelievable. Everything is explainable, and I think that's what makes this book stand the test of time and really what makes it get under your skin. Now, if you're someone who maybe read this in the past, you may not have enjoyed it the first time, or maybe you enjoyed it a little bit, but I'm hoping through this video and through this discussion, maybe you'll have a deeper appreciation or maybe a deeper understanding of some of the ideas presented in the book. The final thing I want to mention before diving in is that there's also another element going on here that may be lost on modern audiences, and that's the element of satire. At the time that this was written, a very popular genre of literature was the adventure story, which would often feature a group of young boys being stranded on an island and going on a fun adventure. There'd be conflict, but nothing too dangerous, nothing too morbid or dark. And by the end of the story, they would come out all right, and they would come out just having a great time and a great adventure. So Golding wanted to take that genre and kind of flip it on its head, almost like we see with I guess a modern example would be like what The Boys, that show The Boys on Amazon, what that did for the superhero genre, how that kind of is a satire on superheroes. And another example would be, this is a little older now, but there was a movie and a book that came out over 10 years ago now, but it was called Warm Bodies. And that was sort of a satire on the zombie genre. Usually anytime a genre becomes too big or really popular, there will be at least a few people, a few notable works that come out that try to satirize that work and kind of not really point fun at it, but point out the flaws in that genre. And so that's also what William Golding was trying to do here. He was trying to say, you know, if there was a group of boys that were stranded on an island, most likely it wouldn't just be a fun adventure, it would wind up turning into a tragedy of some kind. And, you know, what's ironic too about this whole thing is that William Golding never intended this story to be written for young kids. This was not for a young audience. This was for adults. But for some reason, it's taught to a younger audience. I think high schoolers can, for the most part, grasp this idea. But if we're talking about, you know, middle schoolers or sixth graders, I think that's far too young. Even though the characters are really young, it's not really for them. It's for an older audience. Now, there are 12 chapters in this book, and each one has a title, which I always love. I love when titles have names, which you don't really see too often anymore. But there's 12 chapters, and we're going to meet our four main characters in the first chapter, because there's really four that we need to focus on as this book goes on. There's a lot of other characters, but there's four major characters that are very important to track because they're going to grow in much different ways, and they have such great characterization in this novel. That's one of the major strengths of Golding as a writer, is his characterization. So let's start with chapter 1, The Sound of the Shell. So we begin on the island after a plane crash, and this is a tropical island, so it's really hot. There's a lot of bugs. There's pigs on the island. There are fruit like, you know, bananas and coconuts and things like that. There's a lagoon. It's right by the sea. It's really a beautiful island. It's like paradise. And so the way that the boys enter the island, the way that the plane crashes, is it crashes down and it lands on the island, and it doesn't just stop. It comes here and it slides on the island, and it creates this massive scar in the middle of the island. So picture a ton of downed trees and, you know, burnt wreckage and things like that, crushed nature, you know, just a scar across the island. And as you know, a scar is usually a permanent thing. So that's already the book trying to tell us that these boys entering this paradise, it's going to forever change it and them. So we start off and we meet two characters pretty fast. We meet two main characters. We meet Ralph and we meet another character who I'll give you the name in just a little while. So Ralph is described as having fair hair, and he's climbing through the branches and the vines. He's going through it, and he runs into this other boy. And this other boy is a little shorter than Ralph is. He has a little more weight on him too. He has glasses, round glasses, and he has asthma. So all of that stuff's going to come into play. The plump boy, as he's described in the book, he's having trouble kind of navigating over some of the obstacles like the logs and the vines and things like that. And so very soon into their meeting, they're talking about how there's no grown-ups around. They mention how there's a bunch of other kids, but they don't see them yet. But they are quite certain that there's no grown-ups here. But they don't seem too concerned by it. Now keep in mind, these boys are pretty young. They're maybe around 11 or 12. They're not yet teenagers. And so they're not too worried about this. The dread of their situation has not set in at this point. Now, I want to read you the description of Ralph. It takes a few pages. It happens on page 4, but we finally get a good description of Ralph. So I want to mention this before we move on. He was old enough, 12 years and a few months, to have lost the prominent tummy of childhood, and not yet old enough for adolescence to have made him awkward. You could see now that he might make a boxer, as far as width and heaviness of shoulders went. But there was a mildness about his mouth and eyes that proclaimed no devil. So Ralph is described, as this sturdy boy. He has the build of a boxer, of a strong boy. And he also has a face that looks like a very kind face. He doesn't look like he is a devil, as the book says. So he looks kind, and he looks like a boxer for, as far as a little kid is concerned. So he's really just portrayed in a nice way. But anytime you have a major character in a piece of literature, they're going to be complex. And usually what a complex character is that there's going to be conflicting ideas surrounding that character. It could be conflicting motivations, it could be conflicting character traits, or actions, or choices. So just expect that very soon we're going to see him act in a way that maybe goes against the description we just heard. Now, the character, the other boy, who is, kind of plump, he's talking about his asthma, and he's a very talkative young boy. And Ralph asks him his name. And the plump boy says, "I'll tell you my name as long as you don't tell the other boys that name. I'll tell you what they used to call me in school, and I'll tell you." And he says, "They used to call me Piggy." And so right away, when Ralph hears that that's his name or his nickname, Ralph is rolling around on the jungle floor. He is laughing. He's hysterical. He's making fun of Piggy. So that's what I mean by complex. He's described as having a face that looks very kind and proclaiming no devil, yet on the next page he's making fun of really his first friend. And so that's a conflict right there. Now, so he's rolling around, he's laughing, and Piggy's trying to get him to stop, but even Piggy starts to laugh a little bit because Ralph's just going wild. He's just, like I said, he's rolling around, but he's really making a show of it. He can't stop himself. And even Piggy has to laugh a little bit. Now, I should say too, we never learn Piggy's real name. Even the narrator calls Piggy, Piggy. So it's like right away, this book is just giving this character, no praise, no help, I should say. So he is Piggy from this point on. So he's a plump boy with glasses and asthma. His name's Piggy. He's going to be an easy target for these other boys, if you could probably tell. Now, after they, tell each other their names, they decide to go swimming. And, Ralph takes off his clothes, he jumps in the water, he swims. And Piggy doesn't swim. Piggy decides to kind of stay on the side. We can infer that he's maybe a little ashamed to, totally get in the water and swim. His asthma really kind of holds him back from doing anything physical. But it does beg the question, if this character challenged himself a little more physically, would he be able to do these things? Maybe. We don't know. But what it is that he doesn't feel comfortable swimming like Ralph is. What's interesting here, and this is now a little, conflicting thing for Piggy, is that Piggy is kind of making fun of Ralph. And he's saying that you can't half swim well. He's making fun of Ralph's swimming ability, even though Piggy's not swimming at all. So that's kind of odd. Piggy didn't want to be made fun of, but now he's kind of making fun of Ralph. So that's just a little, conflicting thing in his character right there. They talk about their parents, and Ralph says that his father is a naval officer, and Ralph's not worried about being stranded on this island for long. He thinks his dad's going to rescue them very fast. In fact, he says that, my dad told me that the Queen has maps of every island in the world, and so they'll know where we are, and they'll rescue us. And Piggy, very fast, is kind of like, well, how would they know? No one knew where we were going when we left from the airport, and our plane was shot down. We crashed. So how could they find us out? And, in Ralph's head, he's just thinking, because. And he just kind of keeps repeating that. So at this point in the book, Ralph is naively hopeful. That's important. That's going to come back into play. So he's naively hopeful at this point. We find out a little bit about Piggy's backstory here. Piggy says that his dad is dead, and his mom, and then he trails off. We don't really know what the deal is with his mom, but we know his dad's dead. And so he used to live with his auntie, and she had a candy store. And so we can sort of infer that Piggy would eat a lot of candy, maybe to cope with the loss of his parents, and some of that separation anxiety. Either way, his plumpness is explained, because none of the other boys on the island are described as plump. It's really just Piggy is described as that. Now, after all this intro stuff, which I know probably seems a little boring, but this is really important to set the stage for what's to come. Ralph and Piggy walk onto the beach, and they're sort of looking for the other kids. And Piggy says that they need to make a list. They need to make a list of names of all the kids on the island when they actually find them. But the problem is finding them. Luckily, they spot something in the water, and it's in the shallow part of the water right on the beach. And it's a conch shell. It's a conch shell, which I don't know if you've seen one before, but it's something that you could blow into. I mean, you probably could think of it as the shell you put up to your ear and you can hear the ocean. But also the other purpose is that it's sort of like a natural trumpet. And when you blow into it, it makes this loud, deep noise. And so Ralph picks it up, he blows into it, he fails at first, he kind of makes a farting noise, which the two boys laugh at, but then he does it correctly, and it's a powerful, powerful sound. And it booms throughout the island. Birds fly out from the trees, and it really is quite startling. And so this summons all the other boys to where they are. So little kids start climbing in from the forest, and they've got fruit all over their face, because I guess they were hungry after the crash, and they just started eating fruit. And so these kids are coming out. They're kind of like a mess, but they all gather together on the beach. The first boy that they meet, who comes out of the jungle and approaches them, his name's Johnny, and he's a really little kid. And this is where you first start to see the split between the ages. There are some of the older kids who are maybe 10, 11, and 12, and then there's younger kids who are 5, 6, and 7. And so that's kind of like the split between the kids. Later on in the book, they're described as little uns and big uns. After we meet Johnny, we meet another set of secondary characters, Sam and Eric. These are twins, and I want you to view them as one character, because these two characters don't do anything radically different from each other. In fact, later on in the book, their names are pushed together, and Golding gets rid of the word and just puts an N with an apostrophe. So Sam and Eric, it's one character, even though they're twins. They come into play later on in the book. I mean, they're important. They're just not as important as the four main characters we're going to meet, which we know two of them. We know Ralph and we know Piggy. We're just waiting on the other two now. As this meeting is taking place, they look down the beach, and way far down, they notice something heading their way, and it's a little ominous at first. It's a little confusing too, but I'm going to read this section and then we'll talk about what it is. Within the diamond haze of the beach, something dark was fumbling along. Ralph saw it at first and watched till the intentness of his gaze drew all eyes that way. Then the creature stepped from mirage onto clear sand, and they saw that the darkness was not all shadow, but mostly clothing. The creature was a party of boys, marching approximately in step in two parallel lines and dressed in strangely eccentric clothing, shorts, shirts, and different garments they carried in their hands. But each boy wore a square black cap with a silver badge on it. Their bodies from throat to ankle were hidden by black cloaks, which bore a long silver cross on the left breast, and each neck was finished off with a ham-bone frill. The heat of the tropics, the descent, the search for food, and now this sweaty march along the blazing beach had given them the complexions of newly washed plums. The boy who controlled them was dressed in the same way, though his cap badge was golden. When his party was about 10 yards from the platform, he shouted an order, and they halted, gasping, sweating, swaying in the fierce light. The boy himself came forward, vaulted to the platform with his cloak flying, and peered into what to him was almost complete darkness. So what this group is a group of choir boys. So now we've met every single boy on the island. We don't have all their names, but they're all gathered together. So we have some big kids, some little kids, and now we have these choir boys who are mostly made up of older kids. Their leader tells them all to take off their cloaks, because they're all dressed in these black cloaks, which, I'm sure you can imagine, it's very hot. But he commands them, and his name is Jack Merrydew. Now, he's the third main character that we met in this chapter. We're going to meet the fourth one as well. In fact, one of the choir boys faints just as they join the main group of kids on the beach. One of the choir boys faints. He's the fourth main character, but he's fainted right now. He's passed out. So we'll learn more about him a little later on. They're all introducing themselves to each other, and Piggy is doing a lot of the talking. He is introducing everyone to Jack and to the choir, and kind of just explaining the situation a bit. And Jack says, "You're talking too much. Shut up, fatty," which is a very rude thing to do. It's a very rude thing to say. He just met Piggy. He just met Ralph and all these other kids, and he's telling Piggy to shut up, and he calls him fatty. That's really rude and quite mean. Now, Ralph jumps in at this point, and he doesn't do this maliciously. He does this to defend Piggy. He says he's not fatty, his real name's Piggy, because that's what Ralph knows him as. He doesn't know his actual real name, but he knows him as Piggy. So to sort of defend Piggy, he says his name's not Fatty, it's Piggy. But that makes things worse. Sometimes you have good intentions, but the payoff is not always what you expect. Sometimes you try to help someone and you wind up hurting them. And that's kind of what's going on here with Ralph and Piggy. And so they all laugh at Piggy. And like I said, he's an easy target. And he feels embarrassed. He bows his head, his face goes pink, and he kind of shuts up, So we feel bad for Piggy. Now, they decide to vote for a leader. They decide to vote for a chief. And Jack, he says, "Who wants me for chief?" And his whole choir votes for him, obviously, because he's already in charge of them. But all the other kids don't vote for Jack. When it's time to vote for Ralph, all of the other kids vote for Ralph. Now, this is for a few reasons. There's really three specific ones here, which I will read here from this paragraph. But there was a stillness about Ralph as he sat that marked him out. There was his size and attractive appearance, and most obscurely, yet most powerfully, there was the conch, the being that had blown that, had sat waiting for them on the platform with the delicate thing balanced on his knees, was set apart. Sometimes being still amidst chaos, that's almost more noticeable than the most frantic behavior in chaos, because if everybody's acting crazy, then no one's going to stand out. So among all that chaos of the little kids, talking about who should be chief and just the natural energy of little kids, Ralph is there and he's just sitting there quietly. So that's one reason, the appearance of Ralph, but also the conch. The conch is very important. The conch is the thing that summoned them all together, so there is a power there. And that's why, as the book goes on, the conch will continue to represent order, civility and order, law and order. It's the thing that's going to bind them together. And so Ralph becomes chief. And Jack is a little embarrassed himself because, he thought that he should be leader. It's a little hit on his ego, especially because he's the leader of all these choir boys, but now he's not the leader of the island. So his ego takes a hit here. But Ralph, and this is really the first sign of his good leadership skills, he delegates. He says, "Well, Ralph, you can be in charge of the hunters. You will be the head hunter, and all your choir boys will be your other hunters. They'll listen to you. You'll be in charge of them. Even though I'm in charge of the whole island, you'll be in charge of your boys." And so he's already delegating. He's doing a good job right off the bat. They decide to go on a trek across the island to even make sure that it is an island, because they haven't really surveyed it to make sure, and they really need to double check and make sure there are no grown-ups. So Ralph says, "I'm going to go, and I want Jack to come with me, and I want a third person to come." And Piggy, we get the sense he wants to come, and just on the next page he'll say something about that. But the third person that Ralph actually calls to go on this little trek across the island, or this expedition, is the fourth main character, Simon. Simon is the boy who passed out. He was part of the choir. He's awake now, and immediately he agrees, and there's no hesitation. And so that's one of the complex things about Simon, is that he's introduced as this character who is maybe a little more sensitive to the elements, because we can get the sense that he passed out because of the heat of walking in that thick black robe on the beach under the really hot sun. So he's a character introduced. The first thing he does is faint, but he's also not a scaredy cat. Simon is a character who has courage and bravery. He's not afraid to do things, even though he was introduced as someone who fainted. So that's not what you would expect from him. And so those three go off, and Piggy kind of runs up and stops Ralph. And, he says that he wants to come. And Ralph has to be a good leader here, because again, he's chief. This is a new responsibility for this young boy who's only 12. And so he tells Piggy, even though it hurts his feelings, he says, "You're not cut out for this kind of thing. You have asthma, you are plump and all that. You're smarter. You have intelligence. You're the one who said that we should make a list of names on this island. So you're going to have to stay back and get all the names of the kids and make a list. But as far as the adventuring is concerned, I'm going to go, Jack's going to go, and this other kid's going to go, Simon. Before they go, Piggy says one more thing, and he says, the one thing I asked you to do was not tell the other boys that my name was Piggy. And Ralph hesitates for a little bit because he knows that he made a mistake there, but he responds sort of bluntly, and he says, well, better Piggy than Fatty, and then he goes on. And so that really kind of confirms what we thought before, was that, Ralph was trying to defend him originally. He wasn't trying to be malicious, but, it is what it is. And it's also true. I mean, Piggy, when we first met him, he could hardly get over the logs. He could hardly climb through the vines, and he couldn't swim. So it makes sense that he shouldn't go on the expedition across the island. Ralph, Jack, and Simon are walking through the island. They're playing together. They're pushing rocks. They're messing around, and they are developing a bond. They are developing a friendship. And we get to know some of these characters, these three characters in this moment. Simon stops in front of these buds that are on this bush, and he calls them candle buds. He says that they kind of look like candles, but it's a piece of nature. So it's not really a candle, but it looks like a candle. So he gives a name to it. He calls it a candle bud. And that's the kind of guy Simon is. Simon is a little more sensitive. He's a little more poetic. He's in touch with this other side that the other boys don't really have throughout this book, that Simon does. And so there's a part where Simon, is calling the candle bud, and Jack has a knife. Jack whips out his knife and just chops it in half. So that's another bit of characterization for him, is that Jack is a lot more physical. He's a lot more aggressive, whereas Simon is sensitive. And so they make it to this high up point on the island. They look all around. They realize it truly is an island and that they are alone. And Ralph proclaims to the other boys, he says, "This belongs to us," which is quite a statement, because when something belongs to you, you have a responsibility to that thing. If you buy something, you're responsible for it. Or if you have a child, you're responsible for it. Anything that belongs to you, you're responsible for. And Ralph is the ultimate one who's responsible because he's chief. Now, the chapter ends in this very interesting moment here where they're walking. And by the way, throughout this whole expedition, Jack keeps mentioning how he wants to hunt a pig really badly. And so right near the end of the chapter, they actually discover a pig who's kind of caught in a vine, and it's squealing and it can't escape. And so this is a perfect opportunity for Jack to kill this pig and for them to have food. He goes over to it, he takes out his knife, but he hesitates, and the pig gets free and runs away. He lost his moment. He lost his chance. That is what makes Jack complex, is that he is an aggressor. He is definitely more physical. He wants to kill. He wants to hunt, but he hesitates when he has the opportunity. So there's something stopping him from doing that, because for someone who doesn't kill or doesn't hunt, to do it the first time is quite a jump. That is do I want to say scary? It's definitely, yeah, I guess, scary would work, right? For somebody who hasn't hunted before, the first kill would be quite scary. I'm sure there's an adrenaline rush to a degree. And so, you're taking something else's life. There's blood. It's death. It's messy. And again, Jack is only a kid. He's 12 years old, but he hesitates. But after the pig runs away and he kind of makes an excuse for why he didn't kill it, he says next time he'll make sure he does. And so he really promises Simon and Ralph that next time he won't hesitate. And so we get on to chapter 2, and this one's called Fire on the Mountain. Now, the two things that you're supposed to do if you're stranded, you're supposed to create a signal fire, and you're supposed to find water. And then, so in this chapter, they are going to make a signal fire. But at the very beginning, they head back, Ralph, Jack, and Simon, and they sort of relay the message to the other kids. They tell them that, yes, we're alone, we're going to have to survive on this island for a while. And they also invent a rule on this part because everybody's talking at once. It's chaos. Think of, if you're in school, think of how sometimes you have a really rowdy class and everybody's talking at once and there's really no rhyme or reason. So they invent a rule, and the rule is whoever holds the conch gets to speak. That's a pretty good rule. But as you know, rules are often broken. But it's a good place to start. Now, on page 27, which is just a few pages into chapter 2, there's a little boy who wants to speak, but he's too afraid to get up in front of all the other boys. He has maybe some stage fright. So he whispers to Piggy, and this is a nice quality of Piggy. Piggy kneels next to this little boy and kind of puts his ear up to him, and he listens to what this little kid has to say, because Piggy wants to give everybody a voice, not just the big kids, not just the talkative ones, but everybody. And so this shy boy who doesn't really want to get up and speak in front of everyone, Piggy listens to him, and Piggy relays the message. And the message is this: the little boy wants to know what Ralph is going to do about the snake thing. What's the snake thing? This is the first time that we're hearing about something called a beastie, as the boys put it. This is where the anxiety starts to set in on the island, because that's also one of the themes. It's the fear of the supernatural. It's really, fear of the unknown. Now, none of them have seen a beastie, but some of them maybe are starting to think that maybe we did hear a beastie, or maybe we did see something that could have been the beastie. This kid says that the beastie turned into the vines in the trees once the sun came up. And so, we get the sense here that at night when, it's really dark and you can't see, but you can only hear, he's maybe seeing some shadows and hearing some noises. And to him, it looks like a snake thing or a beastie. But they all start to get a little nervous. Not crazy, but a little nervous. Really everybody except for Simon. Although Ralph is very passionate about this too. Ralph is saying, there isn't a beastie. But they all get a little quiet at this moment and kind of think it over for a second. And so they decide to make a fire because they have to have a smoke signal to get rescued. And they head up to the top of the mountain, and this is where they decide to make a fire. And they're all eager. They all are, running around and grabbing big logs and sticks, and they make this huge pile. It doesn't even take that long, and they make this giant pile. But how are you going to make a fire? This is the question. None of them really know how they're going to do it. They don't have matches. They don't have a lighter, But Piggy walks up and they make the connection pretty fast. Piggy's glasses. You can use glass to reflect the sun and start a fire. And so Jack runs right over to Piggy, grabs him, and steals his glasses. So Jack just is a total bully to Piggy. And it's not nice. He hasn't been nice to him since the start. Like I said, Piggy's a easy target, and sometimes people who read this book think of Piggy as being a little annoying. But even still, even if you think he's annoying with some of the dialogue, because he does talk a lot, he doesn't deserve to be treated this way. He doesn't deserve to be insulted right away. And also, for anybody who wears glasses, you know how badly you need those to see. Even if your vision's not terrible, Like for me, I'm wearing contacts, and if I took these out, everything would be blurry. I could still make out, the basic shapes of things, but to take someone's vision, that's a dark thing. That's really a rude thing to do. You're not considering the other person at all. You're just worried about what you need. Oh, I want to start a fire, so I'm going to take your vision from you. It's horrible. They create the fire. They give Piggy his glasses back. And really quickly, the fire just burns up and eats up most of the wood. And there's no smoke. It's just a big fire. And that's what happens, when it's too hot and it's all dry wood and leaves. It's just a quick fire. What they need is wet leaves and wet branches. And so that's what they get to make this smokestack. They also decide to set up a group. They decide to set up shifts of boys who are going to look after the fire, because they have to keep this going, because any time a ship or a boat could pass by, and that could be their chance at rescue. So far they're kind of doing all the right things. They're setting up the proper mechanisms here on this island for survival and possible rescue. This part always makes me laugh, though. This is what Jack says after Ralph says that, we're going to set up groups of boys and have shifts of people who are going to look after the island. Jack says, "I agree with Ralph. We've got to have rules and obey them. After all, we're not savages. We're English, and the English are best at everything. So we've got to do the right things." I just find that kind of funny. The English are best at everything. Because it's just like such a naive and kind of pompous thing for Jack to be saying here, but it's no surprise. So at this point, the fire that they made gets out of control, and a big part of the island starts to set on fire, and the fear sets in because it's getting loud with the crackling noise of the fire, and they're realizing what they've done and that this has kind of gotten out of control. I'm not going to dive too deep into the analysis right now, but this fire spreading, out of their control in a way that they didn't expect, this kind of mirrors the descent into savagery. Because again, we started out with, why do good people do bad things, aka civility into savagery. And so this fire spreading at this point really sort of mirrors that theme here. But so it gets so out of control, and they start to get worried. One of the boys, they realize, is missing. And it's the boy who mentioned that he was afraid of the snake thing, or the beastie. It was that little kid who was too shy to speak. He's described as having a mulberry birthmark earlier on in the chapter, and so he's disappeared. We can infer that this boy got lost in the fire in the woods and burned to death. It's never really told to us exactly, but we can infer it, and then they sort of talk about it a little later on. So that's the first death in this book, is the little boy who was trying to warn about the beastie. All right, on to chapter 3, Huts on the Beach. Some time has passed. The characters in this chapter are described as having some sunburn, they're tan, their hair's getting long, maybe not this long, but it's getting longer. And so some time has passed, and we start off, and Jack is on the hunt. Jack's crouched down in the forest. He's tracking a pig. He finds some fresh droppings, but he doesn't find it. So he returns to the beach, and Ralph is building shelters on the beach. They have a couple built, but Ralph is sort of expressing his frustrations because all the kids said that they were going to help build the shelters. And, the first shelter was built very well because they had a lot of help. But then the second one was only built by a couple of the kids, and now the third one is a wreck because it's only being built by Ralph and Simon. And so Ralph is sort of complaining to Jack. He's saying, well, you're off hunting all day, you haven't caught any meat, and I'm here building shelters. Look what I did. I was able to actually get some work done. I have something tangible to show for all my work. And you've been out every day, you're playing around, running through the woods, you're hunting. Where's our meat? Why don't you stay on the beach and help me build these shelters? So he's feeling a little exasperated at this point. After that, things settle down. They don't get into a full-blown argument. It's just, heating up a little bit. Jack says that sometimes when he's out there hunting, you feel like you're being hunted. He feels like he's being watched sometimes when he's out there. So the fear is now even starting to settle in on Jack, who, again, is our most aggressive character. So that's kind of interesting. Now, Jack talks more about hunting. He if only I could get a pig, he keeps saying. He really, really wants to get a pig. In fact, there's a point where, Ralph is talking about getting rescued, and Jack says something about, well, I'd really like to catch a pig before we get rescued. So his priority is hunting, not the rescue. But the chapter ends, and it's a very interesting sort of passage. It lasts for about 2 pages, and it's featuring Simon. So we get this little episode with Simon where he wanders off in the woods by himself, and it's described with really beautiful, serene imagery. He's walking around. You get the sense like he is one with nature in this passage. He's walking through, and there's some little kids who are reaching for fruit really high up in the trees, and they can't reach it. So Simon, being a little older, he's able to reach up and grab the fruit and give it to the really little kids. He also finds this little hideout. It's this opening in the forest where it's kind of behind some leaves and branches, and he pulls it apart and he goes inside, and it's like a little room in the forest, in the jungle. And it's his own private space. And, I think there are some people who need that time, especially poetic, quiet kinds of people who are a little more sensitive, maybe introverts. Now, again, introverts aren't weak. Simon's not a weak character. He's courageous and brave and not afraid to speak his mind. And he's not afraid of any sort of monster on this island. But people like this, people who are sensitive, who are introverted, they need to take a break sometimes. And so Simon finds a little private space. And now we're at chapter 4, Painted Faces and Long Hair. This chapter starts off with a very strange kind of scene. There's a character named Roger, who I haven't mentioned yet. He's another side character, kind of like Sam and Eric, the twins. But think of Roger as Jack's right-hand man. He's like Jack's sidekick as far as the hunters are concerned. He was with him in the choir, and now he's with him with the hunting. And this is a very strange scene right here, because we're following Roger as he's walking through the forest, and he sees some little kids. There's a kid named Henry who's, kind of playing or bathing in the water area. And Henry doesn't see Roger. Roger's kind of hiding behind some bushes. And Roger starts to throw stones at Henry. Now, he's aiming to miss. He doesn't want to hit Henry directly. He's kind of aiming off to the side, but around him. And, it's very strange. I'll read this section to you here, because something's stopping him from throwing the stones directly at Henry. He kind of wants to, but something's stopping him. So I'm going to read this to you now. Roger stooped, picked up a stone, aimed, and threw it at Henry. Threw it to miss. The stone, that token of preposterous time, bounced 5 yards to Henry's right and fell in the water. Roger gathered a handful of stones and began to throw them. Yet there was a space round Henry, perhaps 6 yards in diameter, into which he dare not throw. Here, invisible yet strong, was the taboo of the old life. Round the squatting child was the protection of parents and school and policemen and the law. Roger's arm was conditioned by a civilization that knew nothing of him and was in ruins. And so this kind of is reinforcing that theme of, again, civility into savagery. We're not quite in savagery yet, but you can start to see it break down. Civilization or civility is still protecting them from falling directly into this savage nature. That's why Roger at this point isn't able to actually strike this boy with the stones. There's almost like a force field around him. Think of it like that. Not literally, but it's like a metaphor. But so something's stopping him there. Now, Jack interrupts this. Jack calls Roger. He says, "Roger," and then he says, "I think I know why I can't hunt the pig successfully. I think it can see me." And so what Jack does is Jack makes a mask out of clay and leaves and berries, and he puts it on his face. He disguises his face, and he looks into the water, and it's a scary look, and he turns to the other kids and he talks to them, and it says the mask compelled them. So the mask has some kind of power. There's something in cultures around the world where masks will help transcend someone's behavior into something they're not. What I mean by that is, I'm thinking of the Igbo culture in Nigeria, for instance. Something that masks did for them would be that around the campfire at night, the village elders, they were called the Agwugwu, and they would dress up in these ancestral masks, and they would do a kind of dance, and they basically would perform, and the idea was that the ancestral spirits would kind of possess them at that time and take them over. And the people watching it, even though they kind of knew that these were just the village elders, there was a sense like, oh my gosh, the spirits are actually going in them. They've done studies on masks and what they can do to someone's behavior. They did a study on cultures around the world, and I forget the exact number, but those who wore masks in times of war were 80% more likely to commit torturous or violent actions. So masks have a power because they remove the person from their own personal responsibility. There is a layer removed. When you put something over your face, it's you, but it's also not you anymore. So that's just something to consider, because that will come back into play. Now, this next part is pretty intense. Ralph and the other boys are basically just hanging out on the beach. They're swimming, all that stuff. And they look in the distance and they see a ship. A ship is passing by. This is their chance at rescue. Unfortunately, they look up and the signal fire has gone out. There is no smoke signal. And so Ralph is freaking out. Ralph darts out from the water. He runs through the woods. He's getting scraped up by all the branches, but he doesn't care about that. He's in a trance. He's just running, and he gets to the top, and the fire is completely out, and no one's watching it. Now, something I forgot to mention before is that Jack promised that his hunters would be the ones who would take turns watching the fire. Some would go out and hunt, others would stay and watch the fire, and then they'd shift positions. But all of them were out on the hunt this time, and none of them stayed with the fire. So the ship passes, and Ralph's upset. Ralph says they let the bloody fire go out. I want to read this paragraph to you because it describes the group of hunters coming up. And this sort of parallels to how they were introduced as the choir boys when they walked up the beach. So listen to how different this is from the original introduction we had. A procession had appeared far down among the pink stones that lay near the water's edge. Some of the boys wore black caps, but otherwise they were almost naked. They lifted sticks in the air together whenever they came to an easy patch. They were chanting something to do with the bundle that the errant twins carried so carefully. Ralph picked out Jack easily, even at that distance, tall, red-haired, and inevitably leading the procession. Simon looked now from Ralph to Jack as he had looked from Ralph to the horizon, and what he saw seemed to make him afraid. Ralph said nothing more, but waited while the procession came nearer. The chant was audible, but at that distance, still wordless. Behind Jack walked the twins, carrying a great stake on their shoulders. The gutted carcass of a pig swung from the stake, swinging heavily as the twins toiled over the uneven ground. The pig's head hung down with gaping neck and seemed to search for something on the ground. At last, the words of the chant floated up to them across the bowl of the blackened wood and ashes. "Kill the pig, cut her throat, spill her blood." That's what they're chanting over and over again as they walk up to where the fire once was. And so they finally were successful. It's just ironic that it happened to be at the same time that the fire went out. So they traded their chance at rescue for this pig. Now keep in mind, Jack and the hunters are not aware that a ship has passed by, at least not yet. So Jack's all excited and he's saying, "Oh my gosh, we killed this pig. Ralph, I wish you were there. I wish you could have seen it." And Ralph says, "You let the fire go out." And Jack says, "We can light the fire again. You should have been with us, Ralph. We had a smashing time. The twins got knocked over." So they're all excited. They're all telling stories of the hunt. It's their first successful hunt. But Ralph just repeats. He says, "You let the fire go out." This repetition made Jack uneasy. And at this point, Ralph says there was a ship. "There was a ship out there. You said you'd keep the fire going and you let it out." He took a step toward Jack, who turned and faced him. "They might have seen us. We might have gone home." This was too bitter for Piggy, who forgot his timidity in the agony of his loss. He began to cry out shrilly, "You and your blood, Jack Merridew, you and your hunting. We might have gone home." Ralph pushed Piggy to one side. "I was chief, and you were going to do what I said. You talk, but you can't even build huts. Then you go off hunting and let out the fire." There was a ship. Some of the kids are pretty shaken at this. A couple of them start to cry because, again, that was their chance at rescue. They could have gone home, and that's a big deal because who really wants to be stranded on an island? Maybe it'd be fun for a little while, but you want to go home. You don't want to have to rely on hunting and pure survival and have no adults around. And so Piggy keeps coming at Jack. Now, it's enough that Ralph is kind of chastising Jack. Ralph's the leader. It's his job to kind of put Jack in his place because Jack messed up. But now Piggy's joining in and Piggy says, "You didn't ought to have to let the fire out. You said you'd keep the smoke going." And Ralph already said that. So Piggy's kind of just pushing it overboard a little bit. But so this drives Jack to violence. The bolting look came into Jack's blue eyes. He took a step and able at last to hit someone, struck his fist into Piggy's stomach. Piggy sat down with a grunt. Jack stood over him. His voice was vicious with humiliation. "You would you, fatty?" Ralph made a step forward and Jack smacked Piggy's head. Piggy's glasses flew off and tinkled on the rocks. Piggy cried out in terror, "My specs!" And so one of the lenses is broken. Which I don't know if you've ever had to deal with this, but when you have one lens that's broken or not working, only being able to see clearly out of one eye and blurry out of the other, that is so obnoxious. That is an obnoxious way to go through life. And now that's how Piggy has to live on this island with one broken lens. Now, I do want to say too, something about how Jack is resorting to physical violence. Piggy is the intellectual one in this group, and he's using words. Yes, he went too far, but he's just using words, and Jack resorts to violence. Oftentimes, people who resort to violence in this kind of way, it's when they don't have the words to come up with a compromise or solve an issue. And, words and language, that's really what separates us from animals, or it's one of the things that separates us from animals. Animals can communicate, but they don't have the sophistication that we have with our words. And so when somebody resorts to physical violence rather than using words to solve a problem, that's bringing them down to the animal level. And actually, when you get angry, your IQ goes down temporarily, but still it goes down. So you want to stop yourself from getting angry because, you don't want to be a stupid person and you don't want to make a stupid mistake like this. But Jack doesn't look at it like a mistake right away. Jack really just doesn't like Piggy, as I'm sure you were able to pick up on at this point. There's really nothing else to say. Jack does apologize, but he makes a point to say, I apologize about the fire that is. And he's saying that he doesn't apologize about hitting Piggy and breaking the glasses. So Ralph just has one thing to say. Ralph says, all right, light the fire. With some positive action before them, a little of the tension died. Ralph said no more, did nothing, stood looking down at the ashes around his feet. Jack was loud and active. He gave orders, sang, whistled, threw remarks at the silent Ralph, remarks that did not need an answer, and therefore could not invite a snub. And still, Ralph was silent. No one, not even Jack, would ask him to move, and in the end, they had to build the fire 3 yards away, and in a place not really as convenient. There's parts in this book where Ralph asserts his dominance as the leader, and this is one of them, where he is upset with Jack. He's upset with the hunters. And so when he tells them to rebuild the fire, Ralph is standing on the spot where the fire was, and he refuses to move. And so Jack and the other boys have to basically move the spot over a bit because Ralph's just standing there, and he's not going to budge. Now, they cook the pig at this point because, again, it was a successful hunt. Yes, they missed their chance at rescue, but at least they do have meat. So they cook the meat, and everybody gets to eat except for Piggy. But before we talk about that, there's a part where, you know what? I'll just read it. Ralph's mouth watered. He meant to refuse meat, but his past diet of fruits and nuts with an odd crab or fish gave him too little resistance. He accepted a piece of half-raw meat and gnawed it like a wolf. This really shows how a simile can have a lot of power in a book, that it's not just meant to be figurative language just for the sake of being figurative language. A simile is able to reinforce theme. So describing our protagonist as gnawing it like a wolf, and using that verb to gnaw, gnawing it like a wolf, it's just reinforcing that theme of civility into savagery, and even our protagonist is a part of that. Now, Piggy wants some food. He's hungry. He doesn't understand why he can't have any. So Simon, being the good kid he is, gives Piggy his meat. Ralph gets annoyed. I'm sorry, not Ralph. Jack gets annoyed and throws more meat to Simon. So now they're all eating. It's just a small little part. Now they start to go a little crazy after they eat. They talk about the hunt and they get really excited. And they reenact it. Maurice pretends to be the pig, and they reenact the hunt. And all of the other hunters are kind of swirling around him and doing a dance, and they're chanting, kill the pig, cut her throat, bash her in. And they're sort of like poking him with a spear a little bit. They're getting kind of outrageous here. And Ralph's looking on, kind of envious. But the chapter ends, and he says, I'm calling an assembly. With the conch, I'm calling a meeting, even if we have to go on into the dark, down on the platform, when I blow it, now. He turned away and walked off down the mountain. So now on chapter 5, it's called Beast from Water. And this is really the first time where Ralph has to think and meditate on what it means to be a leader. Again, that's a lot of responsibility. And so Ralph is walking through as the sun's going down, and he's thinking about what's going on. He doesn't quite understand it because he is just a little kid, but he knows that there's something happening here where they're deciding on things and making rules, but it's just not panning out the way that they had planned. And he's upset, and he's trying to identify exactly why he's upset and why things are starting to break apart a little bit. So they get down, to the assembly spot. It's the latest they've ever had a meeting. And he says, we need an assembly, not for fun, not for laughing and falling off the log, not for making jokes, not for cleverness, not for these things, but to put things straight. So he wants to take it serious. He wants to, reassess things and reassert himself. One of the things he tells them is that something that the little kids are doing, which is sort of gross, is they are going to the bathroom near the bathing pool, but also near where they eat their food and pick their food, like their fruit. It's really gross. So he's telling them not to do that anymore. He's telling them to go use a different spot. And the boys start to get annoyed with him as Ralph's going through these things because he says, and another thing. And one of the kids says, too many things. They don't really want to hear him talk anymore. Now, the big one that they talk about is letting the fire go out, obviously. The meeting sort of devolves into this, it's like a town hall that just falls apart. Like Ralph starts off with good intentions, but then other people start to speak and it just kind of gets chaotic and loses its original point. And so one of the kids, he says that last night he had a nightmare. He could have sworn that he saw the beast moving around in the woods. He doesn't know if it's a nightmare or if it's reality. And Ralph says, well, no one was walking around in the woods, right? Was anyone walking around in the woods? And you know who stands up? Simon. Simon's been going on walks in the woods by himself. Again, it's kind of interesting, he's this character who you would think would be kind of scared and meek in that way, but he's not. He's actually the bravest kid on the island in some ways. Now, there's a little boy, his name's, let's get his name, Percival Weemsies Madison. Now, there's another little boy who kind of steps up to plate and, they ask him what his name is. And then all the other boys start repeating that phrase, what's your name? What's your name? What's your name? It gets kind of crazy. And, Ralph has to shout and say, shut up, let him talk. And he says his name, Percival Weemus Madison. And he says that he thinks the beast comes from water. This sets them all off. They start to, feel that fear come on. The paranoia sets in. Irrationality starts to set in too. And, this is an interesting part here because Ralph gets frustrated and he says, oh my gosh, come on guys, the beast isn't real. Simon, do you believe this? And Simon says, I don't know, but what I mean is maybe it's only us. So he's saying that the beast is them. That's sort of a high-level concept for one of these little kids to think, but it's coming from Simon, so it's believable. Because again, he's in touch with a certain, side that the other kids aren't in touch with. He can see things in a different way. He's kind of like a character who can almost peek behind the curtain and see it for what it is. But he could think metaphorically, and he's more poetic. So it makes sense that he would be able to say something like this. He's more in touch with human nature, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Things really break down after this because Jack calls out Ralph. Ralph is still talking and Jack says, come on, who are you anyway? Who are you to boss us around? And he tries to kind of reassert his own dominance against Ralph. Piggy tries to talk, Jack cuts him off, Ralph defends Piggy, Jack says, go on and defend Piggy. We all know that, you stick up for him no matter what. And Ralph says, but you're breaking the rules. Listen to what Jack says here. Bollocks to the rules. We're strong. We hunt. If there's a beast, we'll hunt it down. We'll close in and beat and beat and beat. And then it says, he gave a wild whoop and leapt down to the pale sand. And most of the other boys follow him as he's shouting and dancing and running away. Ralph is standing there, and Piggy comes up and he tells Ralph to blow the conch. And I think Ralph says something here that it's probably one of the most important lines in the book. It's definitely one of my favorite lines because it does show that Ralph has grown a lot. It shows that he's thinking about things a lot more than he was at the start of this book. He's taking his role as leader seriously, and that means considering all of the actions that he takes. And so Piggy tells him, blow the conch and call them all back, because you wanted a meeting. It didn't end the way you wanted, so just blow the conch and call them back. But Ralph is really perceptive here. Ralph says this: if I blow the conch and they don't come back, then we've had it. We shan't keep the fire going. We'll be like animals. We'll never be rescued. He's right. If he blows the conch and they don't come, then that just shows that they don't respect him, they don't respect the conch anymore, and all sense of authority and rules are over. Simon comes up too now, and so it's Ralph, Piggy, and Simon. And they're all talking. Piggy says something about how if Ralph wasn't there, then Jack would just come after him. Ralph is there almost as a protector to Piggy, which is true. And Ralph doesn't want to be leader anymore. Ralph, since he has now realized the importance and the responsibility of what it means to be a leader, it's a big weight on his shoulders, and he doesn't want to be a leader anymore. But Simon says, you have to be a leader. And Piggy says, yeah, if you don't continue being a leader, then we're done. The chapter ends finally as we hear Percival, Wemyss, Madison crying. And that's the end of chapter 5.
Now on to chapter 6. This one's called Beast from Air. The previous chapter was Beast from Water, and if you haven't picked up on it yet, there are no actual beasts on this island. It's really just the children's imagination that is creating these beasts, and that kind of reinforces the theme that beasts and darkness and evil doesn't come from outside, but comes from inside. And so you have to watch yourself and watch the choices you make so that you don't become a beast, and that's kind of what this book is exploring here. Now, right at the end of chapter 5, I just want to go back for 1 second because there's an important thing that we should highlight before we move on to the next chapter, because it kind of connects, is that at the end of chapter 5, Ralph says, if only they could get a message to us. If only they could send us something grown up, a sign or something. So Ralph is wishing for a sign, and now, right in chapter 6, they're about to get one. Keep in mind, the beginning of chapter 6, though, it's nighttime, all the boys are sleeping, and something is happening in the sky above the island, and then it comes down to the island, and something goes on there too. But none of the boys are noticing this, so this is just the narrator telling us as the reader what's happening. So I'm going to read this paragraph to you. It's on page 83 into 84, and let's see if we can understand what this eerie opening is trying to say. A silver moon rose over the horizon, hardly large enough to make a path of light, even when it sat right down on the water. But there were other lights in the sky that moved fast, winked, or went out, though not even a faint popping came down from the battle fought at 10 miles height. But a sign came down from the world of grown-ups, though at the time there was no child awake to read it. There was a sudden bright explosion and corkscrew trail across the sky, then darkness again and stars. There was a speck above the island, a figure dropping swiftly beneath a parachute, a figure that hung with dangling limbs. The changing wind of various altitudes took the figure where they would. Then, 3 miles up, the wind steadied and bore it in a descending curve round the sky and swept it in a great slant across the reef and the lagoon toward the mountain. The figure fell and crumpled among the blue flowers of the mountainside. But now there was a gentle breeze at this height too, and the parachute flopped and banged and pulled. So the figure, with feet that dragged behind it, slid up the mountain, yard by yard, puff by puff. The breeze hauled the figure through the blue flowers, over the boulders and red stones, till it lay huddled among the shattered rocks of the mountain top. Here the breeze was fitful and allowed the strings of the parachute to tangle and festoon, and the figure sat, its helmeted head between its knees, held by a complication of lines. When the breeze blew, the lines would strain taut, and some accident of this lifted the head and chest upright, so that the figure seemed to peer across the brow of the mountain. Then, each time the wind dropped, the lines would slacken and the figure bow forward again, sinking its head between its knees. So as the stars moved across the sky, the figure sat on the mountaintop and bowed and sank and bowed again. The first time that I read this passage was in high school, and I had no idea what was going on. And then in college, when I had to read it, I think I read this book in one night to prepare for my class discussion. And so I missed it again, what exactly this is trying to say. And forgive me, it was probably like 2 a.m. and I was trying to speed read in order to have a class discussion the next day. And when you speed read, you don't catch all the details. But so what this is describing is that there's a dogfight going on in the sky. That means when planes are fighting each other. And so one of the planes gets shot down, and a man with a parachute ejects from the plane, and he comes down to the island. He is not alive. This parachuter coming down to the island and landing, he is a dead man, but he's attached to his parachute. And so he comes onto the island, and what's really strange, and this is not quite supernatural, but this is where Golding really plays with that idea of taking realism and portraying it in a supernatural way. And so I'll explain what I mean by that. This man is dead, this parachuter. He can't move. But since he's attached to this parachute, and he's on the island, the wind is filling up the material of the parachute, of the canvas. And think of it almost like a jellyfish, where it's opening up and then closing. And so it's moving the man. So when it's deflated, the man is kind of like bowed over, hung. He's got his head between his knees. And then when it fills with wind and the parachute expands, the man comes up like this. So you've got this almost puppet-like movement that this guy is doing, or this corpse is doing. And so he's sort of moving up the mountain in that form. And I don't know about you, but if I was standing outside, even at this age, forget about being a little kid, and I saw that at night, I'd be pretty freaked out. If I was stranded on an island and I saw a silhouette of something like that, I'd be pretty freaked out. So the kids who do see it are Sam and Eric. Sam and Eric are watching the fire, and they see this parachutist, but to them, they can't tell that it's a parachute. They can't tell that there's a man there. They just assume it's the beast. They can hear the canvas material and the flaps filling up with wind, and then they see the sight too, very, very quick glimpse. And so they run away. Okay, they make their way back down to the shelters. They wake up Ralph, and they tell him that they saw the beast. Now, this has a little more merit than the other times that kids have mentioned the beast, because Sam and Eric are a little older. They are given a little more responsibilities than the really little kids, because so far it's really just been the little kids say they've seen something, and Jack said that sometimes when he's hunting, he feels like he's being watched. But now Sam and Eric have seen the beast. And so they decide to hold a meeting, and Sam and Eric describe the beast as having teeth and claws, and really just their imagination is going haywire at this point. But so they're all pretty frightened, and they decide that they are going to go hunt the beast. Now, Ralph decides to go with them as they go on and try and hunt this beast. Simon is sitting there, and Simon, again, he doesn't really believe this, so he's not really eager to get involved in this whole situation. What the boys do, it's Ralph, it's Jack, and the hunters. They go off and they go to one place on the island that they have yet to go, because they've explored everywhere else on the island except for this one spot. And so this is on the far end of the island. It's really rocky terrain. It almost looks like a mountain. There's not a lot of vegetation, if any at all. It's right on the edge of the island, so it's by the sea, and the sea is extra wild on this part, because where the boys are staying, they have the lagoon, and so it's a little calmer because the land blocks the waves from really pounding the island. But on this other side, the sea is just going crazy and pounding the island. And so later on in the story, they're going to refer to this part of the island as Castle Rock. And that will come into play, especially in chapter 11. But so we're still in chapter 6. And so right away, Jack and the hunters are enjoying themselves on this part of the island. They're very excited because it's, first of all, new territory, but second of all, there's some caverns within this mountain, and there's rocks you can push over, and there's a rock bridge, and it's like a new spot, but it's also like a fun place to be because it reminds them of forts, and that's what they start talking about is, oh my gosh, this would be a great place for a fort. We can make our hideout here. And so they're really excited. But Ralph notices that the fire has gone out again. From that part of the island, he can look over at their original spot, and there's no smoke. Which again, the smoke signal is their chance at rescue. So you're going to see this tension throughout this book between rescue and hunting. And we've already seen that Jack and his cronies have chosen, essentially, to hunt for meat rather than prioritize the fire for rescue, and that is what made them miss their chance at rescue. But so there's that tension, and right now they're hunting the beast, but Ralph says, listen, we got to go back. We have to get this fire going again. I can't believe it, guys. And at this point, as the reader, you start to really get frustrated on Ralph's behalf as well. Because right when they say that they're going to do something, right when they say that they're going to keep the fire lit and not mess up again, they go off and they just can't seem to get it together, But you have to remember, these are kids, and so their attention spans are probably not that good, but also they want to play. The dreadful thought of getting stranded on this island forever, that's a tough thing to register in their minds. Only a couple of the kids seem to be aware of that, and Ralph is one of them. Now we're in chapter 7, Shadows and Tall Trees. Now on page 98, Simon sits next to Ralph as Ralph is looking at the sea and thinking things over, because he's got a lot on his mind still. But so Simon, out of nowhere, he says, "You'll get back to where you came from." And it says Ralph was puzzled and searched Simon's face for a clue. And then Simon says again, "All the same, you'll get back all right. I think so anyway." Isn't that such a strange thing for Simon to say? Simon's not one of the little kids, but he's younger than Ralph. And, usually you would think that the older kids would be comforting the younger ones, but it's Simon who is comforting not only an older kid, but also the chief. He says, "You'll get back all right." It's an interesting line. So just keep that in mind as we go through. Ralph joins Jack and the hunters on a hunt for a pig. This is the first time that Ralph is now a part of the hunt. And he throws his spear and he actually wounds the pig. And He feels really excited about this. Ralph doesn't feel scared. He has adrenaline. He's got some pride in the fact that he was able to, hunt this pig. And again, it's his first go. Think of Jack. Jack's first few hunts, he wasn't even close to wounding a pig. But on Ralph's first hunt, he was able to wound the pig. But the pig gets away. They don't get it. And then Robert pretends to be the pig again. This is a game that they kind of play throughout the story. But this time it's even more intense than the first time. Robert plays as pig, and then Jack tells them to create a circle and circle around him, and they start chanting, "Kill the pig, cut his throat, kill the pig, bash him in." And they're like poking at Robert pretty close, actually. Like they're making contact and they're hurting him, so he kind of has to jump out and the game ends. But these kids are just getting crazier by the day. So it's getting late, and the boys are still out looking for the beast. Remember, that's originally why they left the beaches and the shelters. It's because they're looking for the beast. They want to hunt the beast now that Sam and Eric have seen it and vouched for it. Things get pretty wild here near the end of the chapter because Roger, Jack, and Ralph, they decide to go up this other way. They go up the mountain, and there they actually do see the parachuter. And again, same as Sam and Eric, they don't realize that this is just the dead man in a parachute. This looks like a beast to them, and so they run away. It says, Ralph found himself taking giant strides among the ashes, heard other creatures crying out and leaping, and dared the impossible on the dark slope. Presently, the mountain was deserted, save for the 3 abandoned sticks and the thing that bowed. So they all drop their spears and just bolt. They're very scared. Now, chapter 8, Gift for the Darkness. In this chapter, we kind of deal with the fallout of the previous one, which, again, now that Ralph, Jack, and Roger have seen the beast, now the fear is all among the island. They've seen it for their own eyes. They're all certain that the beast is real. In this chapter, Jack actually is the one who calls a meeting among the boys. He grabs the conch, and he has some things to say. So on the bottom of page 111, I've called an assembly, said Jack, because of a lot of things. First, now, we've seen the beast. We crawled up, we were only a few feet away. The beast sat up and looked at us. I don't know what it does. We don't even know what it is. Now, this is where Jack decides to, he takes a chance here, and he tries to assert himself as leader, in this chapter. He tries to basically, it's almost like a coup. He's trying to take over. So he says, Ralph isn't a proper chief. He says that he's like Piggy. He says things like Piggy. And then Jack asks for the boys to vote for him. He says, well, I want to be chief. I'm sick of Ralph's leadership. He's annoying with all the meetings he calls, all the rules he tells us to do. He's insulted my hunters. So I want to be leader. Who's with me? And no one raises their hand. Not even his hunters. No one backs Jack at this point. So Jack actually feels quite ashamed. It's not just an ego hit. It's even more than that. And so he decides to leave. He says, all right then, I'm not going to play any longer, not with you. I'm not going to be a part of Ralph's lot. I'm going off by myself. He can catch his own pigs. Anyone who wants to hunt when I do can come. So he says, I'm going to start my own thing on the other side of the island, and anybody can come with me, but I'm not going to be part of Ralph's group. As he leaves, Ralph shouts and says, no, because he doesn't want Jack to go. When this group splinters, their chances at survival are going to go down. So if there's 2 opposing tribes, or even if one person like Jack is gone, then their chances at survival is diminished. Ralph knows this. That's why Ralph shouts no. But Jack doesn't stop. He just keeps going. And then the narrator tells us that Jack is actually crying a little bit. Not like, not theatrically. He's not going overboard. It's not ugly tears, as they say. It's not an ugly cry. It's really just he's got tears coming down his face. So they decide to make a fire on the beach near the shelters now. They don't want to go up to the mountain where the original fire was, because that's where the beast is, as we know, the parachuter. Now, in this chapter, we kind of cut between different characters. It's almost like a episode of TV where you'll cut to different POVs as the story goes on. And so right now we're going to cut over to Jack. And it turns out some of the hunters have now joined him. So they didn't feel comfortable publicly joining him, but on the sly, they've left Ralph and now have gone to Jack. Now, this hunt, this is a really intense hunt. They wind up hunting the biggest pig that they've found yet. This is a big mama pig. And they describe the way that they kill it is actually quite vulgar. And this is what they decide to do. Jack tells Roger to sharpen a stick at both ends. And so what they do is they cut off the head of the dead pig and they put it on the stick that's sharpened at both ends. So they put it on the top and then they put the sharpened end on the bottom into the ground and they stick it there in the ground. And so you've got this pig head on a stick and it's just in the middle of the jungle. Jack says that they're going to leave an offering for the beast. This is an offering because they know the beast is real, but they want it to leave them alone. They realize they can't really hunt this beast because it's too powerful. And so their best bet now is to leave an offering and just, basically hope that it won't come after them and won't hunt them. After this, we cut over to Simon, and Simon's just walking through the woods by himself. He doesn't know that Jack and some of the hunters have hunted a pig or, left it in the woods on a stick. But he's walking through the woods and he sees it, this pig head on a stick. And so it's quite a sight. If you were walking through the woods just randomly and you happened upon a pig's head on a stick, I think it might freak you out a bit, especially the way it's described here. It says, "The silence accepted the gift and awed them. The head remained there, dim-eyed, grinning faintly, blood blackening between the teeth. All at once they were running away as fast as they could through the forest toward the open beach." That was describing Jack and his crew, but the description of the pig head with the blood blackening between the teeth and its awful grin and dim-eyed, it's really a disturbing depiction of death, really. But so Simon discovers it. Simon's got this terrible headache. There's a ton of flies on this pig head because remember, this is a really hot island, and when it's hot outside and humid, dead animals, they're going to decay a lot faster than if it was colder out. So the flies are already on it. It's stinking. It's just disgusting. And so Simon sees it. And another thing with Simon in this chapter is that he keeps being described as being really thirsty. And so we get the sense that Simon is dehydrated. That's going to come into play in just a couple of pages. Now, we cut back to Ralph and Piggy and the original tribe. And so what happens there is that Jack and his hunters basically surprise attack them, and they don't hurt them, but they steal their fire. They steal a log from the fire because they have to cook their pig, and they don't want to rejoin the original group. So they grab a log from the fire, they run, and then they say, "We caught a big pig. We're going to have a feast on our end of the island, and you guys can come if you'd like." And they refer to Jack as the chief. Ralph is just in shock after this happens. Ralph doesn't know what to do. And so they kind of talk. Ralph is just sitting there. He truly is tongue-tied. And they decide that they are going to go to the feast because they're so hungry. Think about it. Fruit, after so many days, gets old. You can't just eat fruit. And so they want protein. They want more meat. And there's something instinctual that's calling them to join this feast and get some free food. We cut back to Simon for the end of the chapter, and this part is where it dips a little bit into the supernatural, although we know it's really a hallucination that Simon's having. But this, I believe, is one of the scenes that the publishers who rejected this manuscript originally had an issue with. But I think it works because even though the book is written very realistically, and this part is not so realistic, first of all, we know it's a hallucination, But second of all, it's also a one and done deal. It's not like, we read this part and it's like this forever. Plus, the name of the book is Lord of the Flies, and that's who Simon's talking to now. So Simon begins to talk to the pig head on a stick, and the book refers to it as the Lord of the Flies. And we actually get dialogue from the pig head. So that's why I say it's maybe a little more supernatural, although again, we know it's a hallucination. So I'm going to read this part to you from 127 to the end of 128. "You are a silly little boy," said the Lord of the Flies. "Just an ignorant, silly little boy." Simon moved his swollen tongue but said nothing. "Don't you agree?" said the Lord of the Flies. "Aren't you just a silly little boy?" Simon answered him in the same silent voice. "Well then," said the Lord of the Flies, "you'd better run off and play with the others. They think you're batty. You don't want Ralph to think you're batty, do you? You like Ralph a lot, don't you? And Piggy and Jack?" Simon's head was tilted slightly up. His eyes could not break away, said the Lord of the Flies hung in space behind him, or before him. "What are you doing out here all alone? Aren't you afraid of me?" Simon shook. "There isn't anyone to help you, only me, and I'm the beast." Simon's mouth labored, brought forth audible words. "Pig's head on a stick." "Fancy thinking the beast was something you could hunt and kill," said the head. For a moment or two, the forest and all the other dimly appreciated places echoed with the parody of laughter. "You knew, didn't you? I'm part of you. Close, close, close. I'm the reason why it's a no-go, why things are what they are." The laughter shivered again. "Come now," said the Lord of the Flies. "Get back to the others, and we'll forget the whole thing." Simon's head wobbled. His eyes were half closed as though he were imitating the obscene thing on the stick. He knew that one of his times was coming on. The Lord of the Flies was expanding like a balloon. "This is ridiculous. You know perfectly well you'll only meet me down there, so don't try to escape." Simon's body was arched and stiff. The Lord of the Flies spoke in the voice of a schoolmaster. "This has gone on quite far enough, my poor misguided child. Do you think you know better than I do?" There was a pause. "I'm warning you. I'm going to get angry. Do you see? You're not wanted. Understand? We're going to have fun on this island. Understand? We're going to have fun on this island. So don't try it on, my poor misguided boy, or else." Simon found he was looking into a vast mouth. There was blackness within, a blackness that spread. "Or else," said the Lord of the Flies, "we shall do you. See? Jack and Roger and Maurice and Robert and Bill and Piggy and Ralph. Do you? See?" Simon was inside the mouth. He fell down and lost consciousness. And so this is really the first time that we see Simon scared. He's so scared he passes out. Part of it's due to the dehydration, but he's also very frightened of what he's seeing and talking to. You know, the Lord of the Flies is just demeaning him, and really it's his own fears and his own insecurities are coming out. But it's also a warning, because there's some foreshadowing here which is going to come into play in the next chapter. So chapter 9, A View to a Death. Now, Simon wakes up and he sees the pig head on a stick, but he's not hallucinating anymore. So it is what it is. It's just a pig head on a stick. There's no more talking to it. It's actually not even called the Lord of the Flies right here anymore. And so Simon makes his way up the mountain and he gets a good view of the beast. But he's not scared because he knows it's not a beast now. He knows that this is just a dead man, a parachuter. And Simon actually undoes the strings of the parachute because the reason why he was stuck in that position, kind of bowing forward and coming up, was because the strings were caught on some rocks. And so Simon undoes the strings and he kind of lets the parachuter free. But the parachuter doesn't move away, at least not yet. That will come into play just a little later. Now, they all go and they go to have this feast with Jack and his crew, and they are eating meat, and Jack makes another attempt to take power. He wants to know who's going to join his tribe. Ralph jumps up on a rock and says, I've got the conch, I'm chief, you guys voted for me. And Jack says, well, the conch doesn't count on this part of the island. And Ralph says, the conch counts everywhere on the island. But unfortunately, Ralph didn't bring the conch with him, so he really doesn't have any power here. Ralph says there's going to be a storm and there's going to be a ton of rain. Where are your shelters? We're the only ones with shelters on our side of the island. So what are you going to do? Some of the boys seem a little worried about this, but right away Jack says, come on, do our dance. And so right away they have this massive fire going, and they start to do this this dance. It's like a tribal dance, kind of like the one that they've been doing when Robert plays as the pig. And they start chanting, kill the beast, cut his throat, spill his blood. And so just picture a bunch of crazy kids just out on the loose, running around, chanting, screaming, holding their spears above their heads, just going wild. At this point, Simon comes out from the woods. And it's dark out, remember. And so Simon comes out from the woods. It's described like this. The circle became a horseshoe. A thing was crawling out of the forest. It came darkly, uncertainly. The shrill screaming that rose before the beast was like a pain. The beast stumbled into the horseshoe. Kill the beast, cut his throat, spill his blood. The blue-white scar was constant, the noise unendurable. Simon was crying out about something, about a dead man on a hill. Kill the beast, cut his throat, spill his blood, do him in. The sticks fell and the mouth of the new circle crunched and screamed. Listen to the language here. The beast was on its knees, in the center, its arms folded over its face. It was crying out against the abominable noise, something about a body on the hill. The beast struggled forward, broke the ring, and fell over the steep edge of the rock, to the sand by the water. At once, the crowd surged after it, pouring down the rock, leapt on to the beast, screamed, struck, bit, tore. There were no words and no movements, but the tearing of teeth and claws. I mean, it sounds like absolute hell, and what they're doing is they're tearing poor Simon apart. I mean, the description here doesn't really leaves the image of Simon to the imagination, but as far as what they're doing to Simon, that's not left to the imagination. It tells us, screamed, struck, bit, tore, crunched. I mean, they are just as savage as you can imagine it. That's how they are murdering poor Simon, who again is our most sensitive character. And remember, what was he doing? He was on his way back to the beach. He was trying to warn all the other boys that the beast isn't real. He finally had the knowledge that this was just a parachuter. This was not a beast. This is a parachuter. It's a dead man. And so Simon was going to tell all of them that, but now they don't know, and they've just killed Simon. They've killed probably the most innocent boy on the island. And what's interesting here is what Golding does next. So it rains, it starts to pour. Right after they kill Simon, the rain clouds open up and just start pouring down. But besides that, it cuts back to the parachuter, and it says that the parachuter in the storm gets pulled off the island and leaves. So isn't that kind of an interesting parallel where you've got this moment where the kids kill Simon, but they think they've killed the beast. And then the other thing that they thought was the beast has now left the island. So at once, it's almost like two versions of this beast, this fake beast, have just been removed from play. So Golding definitely does that on purpose. Now, because Simon is a major character, and he is my favorite character, I'm going to read this final part on page 137. It's almost like a funeral for him. Not a funeral that the kids are holding or anything like that, but it's a passage that helps us sort of come to terms with the death. And the narrator treats Simon with a lot of respect and dignity in this part. So I'm going to read this. Toward midnight, the rain ceased and the clouds drifted away, so that the sky was scattered once more with the incredible lamps of stars. Then the breeze died too, and there was no noise, save the drip and trickle of water that ran out of clefts and spilled down leaf by leaf. To the brown earth of the island, the air was cool, moist, and clear, and presently, even the sound of the water was still. The beast lay huddled on the pale beach, and the stains spread inch by inch. The edge of the lagoon became a streak of phosphorescence, which advanced minutely as the great advanced minutely as the great waves of the tide flowed. The clear water mirrored the clear sky and the angular bright constellations. The line of phosphorescence bulged about the sand grains and little pebbles. It held them each in a dimple of tension, then suddenly accepted them with an inaudible syllable and moved on. Along the shoreward edge of the shallows, the advancing clearness was full of strange moonbeam-bodied creatures with fiery eyes. Here and there, a larger pebble clung to its own air and was covered with a coat of pearls. The tide swelled in over the rain-pitted sand and smoothed everything with a layer of silver. Now it touched the first of the stains that seeped from the broken body, and the creatures made a moving patch of light as they gathered at the edge. The water rose farther and dressed Simon's coarse hair in brightness. The line of his cheek silvered, and the turn of his shoulder became sculptured marble. The strange attendant creatures, with their fiery eyes and trailing vapors, busied themselves round his head. The body lifted a fraction of an inch from the sand, and a bubble of air escaped from the mouth with a wet plop. Then it turned gently in the water. Somewhere over the darkened curve of the world, the sun and moon were pulling, and the film of water on the Earth planet was held, bulging slightly on one side, while the solid core turned. The great wave of the tide moved farther along the island, and the water lifted. Softly surrounded by a fringe of inquisitive bright creatures, itself a silver shape beneath the steadfast constellations, Simon's dead body moved out toward the open sea. This next chapter, chapter 10, is called The Shell and the Glasses. This chapter picks up the morning after the brutal murder of Simon, and we start off with Ralph and Piggy. At the beginning of this chapter, we kind of deal with the fallout of what transpired the night before, and at first Ralph and Piggy don't talk about what happened, but Ralph brings it up. Ralph brings up Simon's name. He just says Simon. And on 139, he says, "That was Simon." And Piggy goes, "Huh?" And Ralph goes, "That was murder." Now, what's interesting in this exchange is the dialogue between Ralph and Piggy, because Piggy is not, I wouldn't say he's in total denial of what happened, but he's definitely in more denial than Ralph. Ralph wants to talk about what actually happened. He wants to, I guess, vent. He wants to talk about it. He wants to get it off his chest, so to speak. And Piggy just does not help. Listen to what Piggy says at the bottom of 139. He says, "You stop it," said Piggy shrilly. "What good are you doing talking about that? Or what good are you doing talking like that?" He jumped to his feet and stood over Ralph. "It was dark. There was that bloody dance. There was lightning and thunder and rain. We was scared." So Piggy's trying to justify their actions and what happened, because we do learn in this chapter that it wasn't just Jack and it wasn't just his cronies that participated in the death of Simon. It was Ralph and Piggy as well. Maybe they weren't directly the ones responsible for the actual stabbings, but we don't really know. It's kind of left up to our interpretation. What we do know is that Ralph and Piggy were part of the dance. All the boys were in a circle. They were all around Simon, and there was an inner circle and an outer circle. So some of the boys on the very outside of the circle maybe didn't know exactly what was going down, but we get the sense that definitely Ralph knew, and possibly Piggy, that they were on the inside of the circle. On the top of 140, because it's right after Piggy says, "We was scared. Anything might have happened. It wasn't what you said." Ralph says, "Oh, Piggy," and it's this desperate cry, because in a sense, Ralph feels very alone here. He wants to talk about this murder and this horrible thing that happened, but Piggy's sort of in denial, and he's justifying what they did. And this kind of breaks Ralph's heart, because he's very aware of what happened, And he's upset that his friend, the most rational and intelligent one on the island, is trying to justify what they did. And you can really never justify murder. I mean, you could try to, but, at the end of the day, it is just murder. He says, "Don't you understand, Piggy, the things we did?" This part always makes me laugh a little bit, just because Piggy, you wouldn't expect him to say something like this. From what we know about Piggy and the kind of character he is, this is quite a shocking response to hear from him. He says, "It was an accident," said Piggy suddenly. "That's what it was, an accident." His voice shrilled again. Now listen to this. "Comin' in the dark. He hadn't no business crawling like that out of the dark. He was batty. He asked for it. It was an accident." So now he's victim blaming. He's blaming Simon for the murder. Isn't that kind of interesting that these boys savagely murdered this boy? And yes, they were caught up in it, and part of it is true, what Piggy says. It was dark and whatnot, but they knew it was Simon at some point. But they were just so caught up in this mass hysteria, in this frenzy, that they just wound up murdering their friend, the most innocent boy on the island. But Piggy blames it on Simon, which I don't know, I find fascinating. Piggy of all characters, you know what I mean? Sam and Eric come, and they all are not addressing the elephant in the room. They all say, "Oh yeah, we left early." All four of them say that. We all left early. Now, I should say this too. By this point in the book, there's only Ralph, Piggy, Sam, and Eric, and some little kids left in Ralph's group. The majority, and the far majority of boys, are with Jack. So Jack is really the one in charge here of the island. And so things are not looking so good for our protagonist. Now, we cut over to Jack's group, and this is when the book starts to refer to Jack as the chief. So in this chapter, the narrator never calls Jack by name, and the boys don't call him Jack, but everybody calls him the chief, including the narrator. So that means even if the narrator's given in, that is what Jack is. It's kind of like how right when we find out Piggy's nickname, which is Piggy, the narrator just calls him Piggy too. Once the narrator gives in, that gives a lot more credit to that character as far as their name and title. So Jack is chief. There's no disputing it at this point. We find out that there's a boy named Wilfred, because I should back up. Jack's crew is all set up at Castle Rock. And so that's the area that they discovered. It was that one place that they found when they were looking for the beast. And it looks very much like a castle. There's caverns, there's caves. It's on the edge of the island where the water from the sea is just crashing into it. It's high up, it's steep, and there's all these rocks and boulders and rock bridges. And so that's where Jack's group is. But we get a little sense of what Jack's leadership skills are like, which are totally different than Ralph's. Ralph, he would give everybody a voice, everybody a chance to talk. But in this society, in Jack's society, that's not the case. We find out that there's this young boy named Wilfred, and he's been tied up for hours, and they're going to beat him. So anybody who goes against Jack, or anybody who, maybe even has something to say that doesn't exactly go along with what Jack's thinking, they're going to be beaten. So it's a very, it's almost like a dystopia in that sense, where you can't step out of line or, you're toast. Now, they talk about fire because they don't have access to fire anymore, and so they're going to have to keep resorting to stealing fire. So they talk about that. We cut back to Piggy and Ralph and Sam and Eric and those boys, and they talk about the fire too, and they say how they can't really keep the signal fire going because it's only 4 of them. Yes, there's some little kids, but among the older kids, it's just Ralph, Piggy, Sam, and Eric, down by the beach. And so they have their shelters, and they want to keep the signal fire going, but that's a lot of work for just 4 boys. And so they decide to not keep the fire lit at nighttime, because if a ship or plane is passing by, they're not going to see smoke anyway. So they say, you know what, since there's only a few of us, let's just keep the fire lit during the day. So for like 12 or 14 hours during the day. And then at night, we won't do it. They kind of go in and out of sleep. Ralph dreams a little bit. He comes to. But really on page 149, they start to hear some movement in the forest. And it's really creepy. They hear someone getting closer to their shelter. And again, it's pitch black. It's like midnight. And someone starts whispering, "Piggy, Piggy, Piggy, come outside. I want you, Piggy. Piggy, where are you, Piggy?" I mean, imagine if somebody came up to your bedroom window at night, middle of the night, you're sleeping and you wake up, they're whispering your name. They say they want you. They say, "Where are you?" That would creep you out terribly. I know it would creep me out tremendously. All of a sudden, there's just almost like this explosion of chaos. The boys are attacked by an unknown force. We know it's Jack and his group. They've come for Piggy's glasses. That's what it is. So there's a little bit of a tussle. We get the sense like, it describes Ralph punching one of the kids, and it sounds like he's getting some good blows on them, and Ralph gets hit. Once everything kind of settles down, we find out that it really was Ralph fighting with Sam and Eric, or with Eric specifically, and that they weren't actually attacking Jack's group at all. They were just attacking each other, but they couldn't tell because it's nighttime and it was chaotic. But yeah, at the very end, we find out that Piggy's missing his glasses. They took his glasses. So, there's only 2 chapters left now. And now Ralph's group really has nothing. All they have is the conch and each other, and that's not a lot. It's, first of all, going to be very hard to survive even if they have Piggy's glasses, which is the tool they use to make fire. But without it, they're done. So they don't really have many options here. So we're going to find out how they deal with that in the next chapter. Chapter 11, Castle Rock. So this is the penultimate chapter, meaning the chapter before the end. And the boys, they wake up. They're trying to figure out what to do. Ralph has almost given up. He's just at a breaking point since Simon died or was murdered. But he just doesn't know what to do at this point. So you have to hand it to Piggy, because Piggy right now, he's the one who is leading the charge. He's saying, "We have to go. We have to get my glasses. They stole my glasses, and I know I'm not the strongest one, but I'm going to go there and I'm going to tell them what's right." So Piggy is the one carrying the torch of morality, because morality has kind of faded away from this island at this point. And so Piggy is the one who's going to go and re-explain what's good and what's bad, or what's good and what's evil. They hold a little assembly, but again, it's just the 4 boys. But they still have the conch, so there's a respect there. Piggy says this. He says, "I'm going to him with this conch in my hands. I'm going to hold it out. Look, I'm going to say, you're stronger than I am, and you haven't got asthma. You can see. I'm going to say, and with both eyes. But I don't ask for my glasses back, not as a favor. I don't ask you to be a sport. I'll say, not because you're strong, but because what's right is right. Give me my glasses, I'm going to say to you." Piggy ended, flushed and trembling. He pushed the conch quickly into Ralph's hands, and though in a hurry to be rid of it, and wiped the tears from his eyes. The green light was gentle about them, and the conch lay at Ralph's feet, fragile and white. A single drop of water that had escaped Piggy's fingers now flashed on the delicate curve like a star. And so this shows that Piggy has courage. Yes, he's even shaken up from the thought of confronting Jack, because he probably doesn't have that great of adrenaline control, but he's feeling that adrenaline pulse, and when you can't control it, you start to shake, you might tear up a little bit. So that's happening to Piggy, but he still wants to confront Jack, and he's afraid, but he wants to do it anyway, and he's going to do it. But that's true courage, that's true bravery, which, that's a quality of a leader. That's another aspect that makes Piggy complex, is that, and I think we mentioned this at an earlier chapter, but that he has some natural abilities that a leader would have, but he's also an easy target. There's something about him that it makes it really hard for other kids to follow. They don't respect him, and it could be the way he looked, it could be the way he speaks or sounds, but either way, he does have some natural leadership skills. As far as, courage and bravery, which again is one of those leadership skills, being brave, having courage, that's doing something even if you're afraid of it. If you had no fear and you were able to do anything you wanted, that wouldn't require bravery or courage. Courage and bravery, a prerequisite for that is to be afraid to a degree. So you need some fear. So it's really fear plus action equals courage. And so that's what Piggy has. They're planning to go. Ralph says he'll go with them. And Sam says this, and this harkens back to chapter 4, which was painted faces and long hair. He says, "He'll be painted," said Sam timidly. "You know how he'll be." So like we talked about how, warriors in cultures around the world, when they would wear face paint or masks, they were 80% more likely to commit torturous or violent acts. Sam's, talking about this. He's saying that Jack is going to have his painted face on, and probably all the other boys too, or most of them. And so they're going to be extra violent, extra savage because of that reason. Ralph says he's going to go, and he actually wants them all to wash up before they go. He wants to present a different kind of look than that savage look, because over time, and they've been on this island for quite some time, students have asked me before how long. We don't know exactly how long, but it's definitely more than just a few weeks. It could be a few months, it could be several months. I wouldn't say over a year. That seems like a little too long, but it's been quite some time. And so Ralph wants to basically have them all wash up and get the dirt off their face and whatnot before they go confront these savages. Because again, Ralph, Piggy, Sam, and Eric, these are the only boys who are in favor of civility right now. And that's what this is, civility versus savagery. So they set off, and there's this sentimental part as they walk past Simon's death spot, the place where he was killed, right by the beach. His body's not there, as we know, because it was washed out to sea at the end of chapter 9. But still, there is this tone in this part that comes up that really kind of makes you reflect on what had happened. And I think Ralph is reflecting on what happened the night before too. Now they make it to Castle Rock. Roger says, "Halt, who goes there?" And Ralph says, "You can see who I am, stop being silly." Because they have their own rules now, Jack's group. And I guess one of them is, make sure you ask who approaches Castle Rock. But it's silly because it's not like there's anybody new on the island. So Ralph says, "Come on, you know me. We were in the same tribe. I was your chief. So just drop the formalities, drop the rules here. We have something important to say." So Ralph blows the conch, and the kids go silent. The kids actually go silent because the conch still does have power, even if they haven't totally respected it throughout the book, and it hasn't gone exactly according to plan. Remember, the conch was the thing that drew them all together at the start. So even this far into the book, after most of the island has descended into savagery, the conch still does hold some type of authority, and Ralph along with it. Now, Roger starts throwing stones at them, and again, he's aiming to miss, just like he was to that other boy earlier on. And it says, and this is a very strange line on 158, it says, "Some source of power began to pulse in Roger's body." Keep that in mind as we continue reading, because that's going to come into play in a big way. So they call for Jack. Ralph steps forward to confront him. Piggy says, "Don't leave me." And, because again, Piggy is basically blind. He doesn't have his glasses, so he can't see. He has to be led around now by hand because he's unable, he doesn't have vision, any kind of vision at all. This part's interesting because Ralph tells Jack that he must return Piggy's glasses, and Ralph calls him a thief. And Jack takes some offense to this. Jack says, "Say that again," and he doesn't want to be called a thief, which is interesting to me because, and this again shows some kind of complexity of Jack's character. You wouldn't think that he'd be offended for two reasons. One, because, well, it's the truth. Jack is a thief. He stole the fire first, and then he stole the glasses. So, yeah. The other part is that Jack's group have descended into savagery. So, at that point, why would they care about petty things like being called a thief? You know? But there's still something in him. There's still his pride. There's still his ego. And he doesn't want to be brought down to that level of thief, at least not with words. And remember, Jack has problems with words. When he can't resolve things with words, he resorts to physical violence. So what happens next is that Ralph and Jack fight with spears. And they're going back and forth. It's on the edge of the cliffside. It's epic. Piggy has the conch, and he says, listen, we've come to say this. Or, I'm sorry, Ralph says this. Listen, we've come to say this. First, you've got to give back Piggy's specs. If he hasn't got them, he can't see. You aren't playing the game. And then Ralph makes a whole thing about the fire. The kids don't want to hear it. But Ralph, and this part really shows the growth of his character, because remember at the beginning, Ralph was naively hopeful. He said, oh, of course they'll rescue us because. You know, my dad's a naval officer. He'll know how to find me. He told me that the Queen has maps in her room and they have every island recorded so they can find us. But now Ralph understands the gravity of the situation. So if you look at the bottom of 160, it says, don't you understand, you painted fools? Sam, Eric, Piggy, and me, we aren't enough. We tried to keep the fire going, but we couldn't. And then you, playing at hunting. It's a lot to admit that you aren't enough. And this is something that shows that Ralph has really come into his own. He's coming of age, and he's growing tremendously, because at the start of the book, he wouldn't be able to admit any of this. But now, at this desperate moment, he's saying, guys, we will not survive. We're going to be either stranded on this island forever, or we're going to die. But we have to work together, because me, Piggy, Sam, and Eric, we're just simply not enough. So he's calling for help. Now, Jack responds to this by telling his cronies to tie up Sam and Eric. And so the tribe tie Sam and Eric up, they take them captive. Now it's just Ralph and Piggy against Jack's entire tribe. Their chances are seeming quite slim. Ralph loses his patience. He says, you're a beast and a swine and a bloody, bloody thief. And he charges at Jack, and they start fighting even more. And now Piggy has the conch, and Piggy says this. Piggy says, I got to say this, you're acting like a crowd of kids. Which is better, to be a pack of painted Indians like you are, or to be sensible like Ralph is? Which is better, to have rules and agree, or to hunt and kill? So Piggy's making this final plea. You know, he's trying to use persuasive techniques to get these kids to see things from his point of view. And then we cut to Roger. And remember that power that was pulsating in Roger before, and the fact that he was throwing stones? Well, now he's going to throw a big stone. There's a stick lodged under a giant boulder on the edge of Castle Rock. And so Roger takes that stick. Here's a stick I'll show you here. He puts that under the boulder and he lifts up. It props the boulder down. The boulder flies off the edge, and I'll read you the paragraph. The rock struck Piggy a glancing blow from chin to knee. The conch exploded into 1,000 white fragments and ceased to exist. Piggy, saying nothing, with no time for even a grunt, traveled through the air sideways from the rock, turning over as he went. The rock bounded twice and was lost in the forest. Piggy fell 40 feet and landed on his back across the square red rock in the sea. His head opened and stuff came out and turned red. Piggy's arms and legs twitched a bit, like a pig's after it's been killed. Then the sea breathed again in a long, slow sigh. The water boiled white and pink over the rock, and when it went sucking back again, the body of Piggy was gone. This time the silence was complete. Ralph's lips formed a word, but no sound came. And so this is really a dramatic moment. You know, academics sometimes will go back and forth on, they don't totally agree. Some people say that Simon's death is the climax. Other people say that this moment is the climax, the death of Piggy. And for good reason too, because not only does Piggy die, and in such a horrible way, I mean, this boy didn't deserve any of this. You know, I wouldn't say he was more innocent than Simon, because, you know, Piggy would pick fights with people and he wasn't afraid to make his voice known and say, hey, you're doing something wrong, but he didn't deserve this. And so he dies in such a brutal way. This giant boulder hits him and his head cracks open and the fluid in his brain starts to come out. It's really, really gruesome. And this isn't at nighttime like it was with Simon. So it's not like this gore is hidden from all the other kids. They see this. This is daytime. They totally have good vision of what's going down. But the other important thing is when Piggy gets hit, it also says the conch exploded into 1,000 white fragments and ceased to exist. Now, this is really where a writer can use language to their advantage to really explore theme and make it beautiful too. You know, like a writer of lesser skill could have just said the conch broke. But instead, he says the conch exploded into 1,000 white fragments and ceased to exist. It ceases to exist. It's gone. It's dust. It's powder. And so that also goes along with law and order, civility. Those are gone at this point. So we've lost the character that represents intellect and rationality, but we've also lost this very important symbol that has tied the group together since chapter 1. And now in the penultimate chapter, it's dust. It's just gone in the wind. There's no time to process this. There's no, funeral scene like there was with Simon where the reader got to process everything. We just kind of go on and more action transpires. So Jack basically jumps up and it says he began to scream wildly. See, that's what you'll get. I mean that. There isn't a tribe for you anymore. The conch is gone. He ran forward, stooping. I'm chief. So now it's official. Not only has the narrator referred to Jack as chief, now Jack is proclaiming, I am chief. And now that the conch is destroyed, he can do that with certainty. Now again, there's no moment to process this. They start throwing spears at Ralph, and Jack's spear comes across and it slashes Ralph right across the torso, tears flesh, it tears skin, he's bleeding. So Ralph turns, he starts running, and all the kids are throwing spears. Now it says this, it says, Ralph turned and ran. A great noise of seagulls rose behind him. He obeyed an instinct that he did not know he possessed and swerved over the open space so that the spears went wide. So he's going in and out. He's serpentining. He's dodging spears. He is obeying an instinct he didn't know he had. Some of the ancient Greek philosophers would have called this the wisdom of the body. There's some kind of animal instinct that we do possess when we face life and death situations. And so Ralph is running off pure adrenaline. And, he knows if he trips right now, he's dead. He can't mess up. He's got to dodge and run perfectly. And so that's what he does. And he gets away. Now we get this little page break at the very end of the chapter. And, Ralph's run off. He's safe for the time being, but we're with Jack and them. And they have Sam and Eric, and they're threatening Sam and Eric and kind of torturing them a bit by poking them in the ribs with spears. And Jack wants to know, what do you think coming here with spears? Why didn't you join my tribe before? They kind of speak up for themselves a little bit. But then it says this, Roger edged past the chief, only just avoiding pushing him with his shoulder. The yelling ceased, and Sam and Eric lay, looking up in quiet terror. Roger advanced upon them as one wielding a nameless authority. And so that nameless authority is the fact that Roger is a killer. And again, it's different than when Simon was killed, because that was a group effort. It wasn't like they said, oh, there's Simon, let's kill him. They mistook him for the beast, and then they kind of knew it was him, but they kept going. It was in that murky gray area. It was a frenzy. It was mass hysteria. The death of Piggy is straight up murder. Roger knew what he was doing when he pushed that boulder off, and it falls down and it kills Piggy, and so Roger is a killer. So now there's this dark energy swirling around him that other people can pick up on. That's the nameless authority. Murdering someone changes you, and so for Roger, he is a changed person. Totally different than Ralph. The way that Ralph has changed. This is a dark change. This is not a good one, because now he's a absolute murderer. We have one more chapter left. Let's get to it. Chapter 12, The Cry of the Hunters. So, after Piggy is brutally murdered by Roger and all of the boys try to kill Ralph, Ralph is hiding in a little space, not too far from Castle Rock. For some reason, he decides to stay a little closer. He didn't want to go too far. He felt like he wanted to kind of keep an eye on them and be able to listen for if they pursue him. That way he could make a plan. So he's kind of staying close in order to keep an eye on them. Now, Ralph starts to move around. He starts to make his way through the woods because he wants to get some food. He's not going to be able to hunt by himself. He's not really a well-trained hunter, but he grabs some fruit and he eats it. But he also stumbles upon Simon's old friend, the Lord of the Flies. So he finds the pig head on a stick. The only difference now is that there's no flesh left on the pig head. It's pure white bone. So it's like a skull. It's a pig skull on the stick. And it's actually described as being just as white as the conch. Now, I want to read this section to you from page 167 for when he discovers it, because this again is where Golding will play with that idea of using realism to to portray realism in a supernatural way. So let's read this part. The slanting sticks of sunlight were lost among the branches. At length he came to a clearing in the forest where rock prevented vegetation from growing. Now it was a pool of shadows, and Ralph nearly flung himself behind a tree when he saw something standing in the center. But then he saw what that white face was bone, and that the pig's skull grinned at him from the top of a stick. He walked slowly into the middle of the clearing and looked steadily at the skull that gleamed as white as ever the conch had done and seemed to jeer at him cynically. An inquisitive ant was busy in one of the eye sockets, but otherwise the thing was lifeless. Or was it? Little prickles of sensation ran up and down his back. He stood, the skull about on a level with his face, and held up his hair with two hands. The teeth grinned. The empty sockets seemed to hold his gaze masterfully and without effort. What was it? The skull regarded Ralph like one who knows all the answers and won't tell. A sick fear and rage swept him. Fiercely, he hit out at the filthy thing in front of him that bobbed like a toy and came back, still grinning into his face, so that he lashed and cried out in loathing. Then he was licking his bruised knuckles and looking at the bare stick, while the skull lay in two pieces, its grin now 6 feet across. He wrenched the quivering stick from the crack and held it as a spear between him and the white pieces. Then he backed away, keeping his face to the skull that lay grinning at the sky. There's a lot going on here. Ralph feels some kind of energy from this skull on a stick. He asks the question, or was it about, the thing was lifeless, or was it? It's described as grinning at him. And Ralph is overcome with this sickly kind of rage, and he's feeling disturbed. And so he punches the thing. He breaks the skull in two. So it's clean. I picture it kind of clean in the middle. It's not described that way, but it says the skull lay in two pieces. Its grin now 6 feet across. So it's spread out. But still, there's a connection between the two pieces, connected by that grin. You could still almost make out the face, but, even though it's split. And the most interesting part with this interaction is that Ralph now dislodges the stick from the ground, and that's going to become his weapon. He's going to use this stick as a spear. So, we'll get into more of that with the analysis, but it's a very interesting thing for him to take the stick from the Lord of the Flies, which is really supposed to represent evil and darkness and the devil or Beelzebub. And now he's using it. The thing that propped the Lord of the Flies up, he's going to use that as a weapon, or at least as a tool to defend himself. So we'll talk about that and how this has something to do with the idea of integrating one's shadow. So he goes off. It's nighttime, and he makes his way to the edge of Castle Rock, and he sees Sam and Eric on guard. And so he calls out to them, and he's trying to talk to them. They are now part of Jack's group, even though they don't really want to be. They would choose to be with Ralph. They were forced to now be part of Jack's group. And they were instructed to alert Jack, alert Roger, tell them that, if they see Ralph. But instead, they just tell Ralph to get out of here. They say, Ralph, come on, you gotta go. Get out of here. Save yourself, essentially. They can't really spend too long talking to him, because if they're caught talking with the enemy, who's Ralph now, then it's their lives. Again, I told you that Roger is a murderer, and so he has this threatening presence anywhere he goes. And so Sam and Eric know what he's capable of, and they don't want to cross him because they don't want to die. They communicate to Ralph. They say, tomorrow Jack has instructed all of us to hunt you. So they're going to set off on a hunt, just like a pig hunt, but they said this time it's going to be dangerous because Ralph is going to be fighting back. And their plan is to spread out all across the island and find him that way. Remember, it's not a huge island, so if they really work together and do that, they would be able to find him. And Ralph keeps asking, when they find me, what are they going to do? When they find me, what are they going to do? The twins can't answer him just yet, but they will in a little while. Sam gives Ralph some meat, and thank God for that, because, Ralph needs protein. Ralph needs some sustenance. He's only been living off of fruit, and so he needs this, especially if tomorrow he's going to be hunted. He's going to have to run and really burn a lot of calories. So it's a good thing Sam gave him some food. But Ralph asks one more time, what are you going to do? They answer him. They say, Roger sharpened a stick at both ends. Now, we know what that means. The last time a stick was sharpened at both ends, that was when they decapitated the pig and put its head on the stick as an offering to the beast. So we get the sense that that is what they plan on doing with Ralph. They're going to decapitate him, put his head on a stick, and leave it for the beast. But Ralph doesn't make that connection just yet, because he's not aware that that's what they had done with the Lord of the Flies. Now, he goes through the night, he yearns for bed sheets, he just wants to go home, he can't figure out why things have gone the way they've gone. It's a bad night of sleep. He wakes up, and immediately he knows that they're, coming after him. And Ralph is hidden in the thicket. So, there's the jungle and there's some open areas, but there's also some really, really thick areas. That's where he's hiding, in places that it would be harder to see him. But the boys start pushing more boulders off Castle Rock and just rolling them into the forest to try to scare Ralph out so that it'll make the hunt a little easier. There's a part where Ralph sees one of the boys. He sees a shadow of one of the boys walking right in front of the thicket. And so Ralph takes his spear, he stabs it through. He actually stabs one of the boys. We don't find out who it is or what kind of damage it is, but he's in defense mode. He knows they're trying to kill him, so he's going to strike first. They just were rolling boulders at him, so they're already trying to take him out. So they're making their, they have this cry. It's an ululation, which is ooh. That's the sound they're trying to make when they're chasing him. If they see something, they're supposed to make that sound, and then they kind of coagulate and continue hunting. But that's how they're communicating with each other as they go through the island. Ralph keeps saying that he just has to survive. He's saying he has to think really clearly. He's having trouble thinking because, again, he did have some meat, but not a lot of food, and he's just at the edge. He's been through too much. He's not only physically exhausted from his wounds and from all the running, but he's mentally and emotionally exhausted. Think about it. He's seen 2 of his friends die within just a couple of days, and now he's being chased by people he once was the leader of. So you can imagine what he's going through. Ralph makes the connection when he looks at his own spear and he sees that it's sharpened at both ends. He makes the connection now. Now he knows, oh my gosh, they did that with the pig head. They're going to do it to me. And it's a really, really shocking realization for him. Right toward the end on the page 180, Ralph is just running desperately for his life. Boys have set the island on fire. The fire's out of control, even more so than it was in chapter 2. They're trying to smoke him out, which basically means they want to make it so hot and uncomfortable and smoky that Ralph has to leave his hiding place and run into more of an open area so that they can catch him more easily. So they're smoking him out. He runs, it works. They're chasing him. He's at the edge of exhaustion. He collapses and he's trying to cry for mercy. Then we get a page break and it says this. He staggered to his feet, tensed for more terrors, and looked up at a huge peaked cap. It was a white-topped cap, and above the green shade of the peak was a crown, an anchor, gold foliage. He saw a white drill, epaulets, a revolver, a row of gilt buttons down the front of a uniform. A naval officer stood on the sand, looking down at Ralph in wary astonishment. On the beach behind him was a cutter, her bows hauled up and held by 2 ratings. In the stern sheets, another rating held a submachine gun. The ululation faltered and died away. The officer looked at Ralph doubtfully for a moment and then took his hand away from the butt of the revolver. "Hello." Squirming a little, conscious of his filthy appearance, Ralph answered shyly. "Hello." The officer nodded as if a question had been answered. "Are there any adults, any grown-ups with you?" Dumbly, Ralph shook his head. He turned a half pace on the sand. A semicircle of little boys, their bodies streaked with colored clay, sharp sticks in their hands, were standing on the beach making no noise at all. So, all the boys are there on the beach. They are shocked and not moving because a naval officer has arrived with a ship. They've been rescued. And now that they've been rescued, everything is put into perspective. The only one who talks to the naval officer is Ralph. All the other boys are too frozen in shock. On the last page, I find this part so interesting. The naval officer asks Ralph, "Who's boss here?" And immediately, with no hesitation, it says, "I am," said Ralph loudly. So it says, Ralph says, "I am boss," and he says it loudly. There's no hesitation, no shyness, no fear. He proudly proclaims that he's the one in charge. This shows that Ralph is a true leader. A true leader is willing to take responsibility, especially when things go wrong. And so he was voted chief from the start, and it's his responsibility that things went the way they are. Things did not go according to plan. People got murdered. A little boy died in the fire. Things went crazy. Ralph still takes responsibility at the end. It would have been much easier to just point at Jack and say, he's the one in charge, blame him. Instead, Ralph takes responsibility. He says he's leader. Now, listen to this, because I find this kind of funny. Right after Ralph says, "I am," it says, "A little boy who wore the remains of an extraordinary black cap on his red hair and who carried the remains of a pair of spectacles at his waist started forward, then changed his mind and stood still." That's Jack. And he's described as a little boy here. So he went from being described as, head of the choir, head of the hunters, and then chief. And now on the final page, things are brought back to balance. Ralph is proclaimed as leader by himself, but still. And Jack is proclaimed as a little boy by the narrator. It just really puts things into perspective now. I'm going to read this final part of the book because it is one of the most famous endings to all of Western literature, so I think it's important to read aloud in its entirety. "We saw your smoke, and you don't know how many of you there are?" "No, sir. I should have thought," said the officer as he visualized the search before him. "I should have thought that a pack of British boys, you're all British, aren't you, would have been able to put up a better show than that. I mean, it was like that at first," said Ralph, "before things—" He stopped. "We were together then." The officer nodded helpfully. "I know. Jolly good show. Like the Coral Island." Ralph looked at him dumbly. For a moment, He had a fleeting picture of the strange glamour that had once invested the beaches, but the island was scorched up like dead wood. Simon was dead, and Jack had. The tears began to flow, and sobs shook him. He gave himself up to them now, for the first time on the island, great, shuddering spasms of grief that seemed to wrench his whole body. His voice rose under the black smoke before the burning wreckage of the island, and infected by that emotion, the other little boys began to shake and sob too. And in the middle of them, with filthy body, matted hair, and unwiped nose, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true, wise friend called Piggy. That part at the very end, when they finally cry, it's emotional because it's finally a release for Ralph and the boys, but it's also a release for the readers. If you read this straight through, you would get the sense of plot and theme, and there's things that you would get along the way, but tracking the emotions, if you were unable to track the emotions, this is really where it hits you in the gut. When these boys all finally break down and cry together, Ralph being the first among them, it's finally a chance to mourn everything they've done. And it's not just mourning the death that has gone on the island, but as we see here, it says, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart. In other words, Ralph is no longer a child. Really, none of these kids are children anymore because they know too much. But Ralph especially. Ralph is weeping for the end of innocence. Childhood is gone. He's now a man because of what he's been through. But it says he's weeping for the darkness of man's heart. He's now aware. Like that question we started with, why do good people do bad things? He's learned. He's learned that good people do bad things. But it's that question that possibly remains unanswered that is making him cry. Why? Because he doesn't understand. He keeps wondering. Things were good and they keep breaking apart. Why? Why do good people do bad things? And he's weeping and he's crying at the end. And all the boys are crying, and the final paragraph, it's very short. It's right after that great line about weeping for the end of innocence and darkness of man's hearts. But the officer basically turns away from the boys because he's a little embarrassed. He wants to wait to let the boys pull themselves together. So he can't even really look at them as they cry. It's too much for him to bear. So imagine these little kids. If it's too much for a naval officer to bear, even just looking at little kids crying at this point, imagine what Ralph and the rest of them are going to have to bear now that they are going back to civilization and society. Some people have criticized this book as having an ending referred to as a deus ex machina. A deus ex machina is a Greek term, which if you're unfamiliar with it, it's used in modern times to refer to a cheap ending. A cheap ending is one that solves all the problems in a really fast way. And so people have criticized this ending because they're rescued so fast. The word deus ex machina, that phrase, that translates to God from the machine. And so in ancient Greece, when they used to put on plays, the plot lines would get so intricate and complicated, and it would be really tough for the writer to solve them in logical ways. So what they would do is they would just lower a god on this platform by rope. Someone would, pull the rope, and this guy dressed as a god would come down on the stage, and he would just solve all the problems. He would just come up with very quick explanations for all the problems and how to solve them, and then he'd wrap up the plot really fast. So that's where we get Deus Ex Machina. But I would argue that this book is not a Deus Ex Machina at all, for a couple of reasons. One, logically, it does make sense that they would be rescued at this time. This fire that they've lit, they've set almost the whole island on fire, so it's such a huge smokestack that it would be very hard for any boats in the area to not see them. And we know, they missed a boat earlier in the book, and there was a dogfight in the sky, so it's not like they're totally far away from whatever war is taking place, which we never get details about, by the way. So that makes sense logically. The other part, too, is that yes, they're rescued, but I wouldn't say that solves their problems. If anything, it's now they have a lifetime of trauma. They have a lifetime of problems because they have to deal with the knowledge of the darkness of man's heart. They have to deal with the consequences of what they've done. Even if they're not, punished by law or punished by society, they still have to deal with every choice they made on that island. And so that to me is an even darker ending, a much more unnerving ending than just thinking, oh, they're rescued, everything's fine. It's not that simple. It's not all about the rescue. It's about taking the experience with them now that they're rescued. In some ways, staying on the island and dying on the island might have been the easier way out, because now it's a lifetime of trauma. It's a lifetime of having to unpack what they did as children, and it's brutal. When you can really understand this book and read it from front to back, you can see how disturbing it really is. The horror of Lord of the Flies really comes from the idea that any of us are capable of evil. They did a study on Nazis during World War II, and they found that they were ordinary men who wound up doing horrible things. I think for a long time, people assumed that the Nazis were unique or that there was something wrong with their brain. But instead, what researchers discovered was that these were just ordinary people who, under the right conditions, in the right circumstances, were able to become true monsters. And so that's really what this book is trying to say, is that we're all capable of these horrible things. One thing I would like to mention, because it seems to be a topic that a lot of people who teach this book, especially at the college level, like to dive into, is the Freudian analysis. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but if you're familiar with Freud's concept of the ego, superego, and the id, then you can see that there's a connection between these three ideas and three of the main characters. Just to put it briefly, Ralph is supposed to represent the ego, or the consciousness, the one really in control. The superego is where Piggy comes in. He represents rationality and moral thought, and that's really what the superego is supposed to do in our minds. And the id, that's where Jack would come in. That's more of the animalistic, base level needs, the selfish desires that you're willing to do anything to get what you want. And so in the book, Ralph acts as kind of a mediator between Jack and Piggy. And it's the same way that our ego is a mediator between our superego and our id. Think of it almost like the ego is the one driving a car, and you've got the superego and the id telling the ego where to turn and where to go. And so it's up to the ego to decide which one to follow and who to listen to. There's one other concept I want to get into before we wrap this video up, and it's the idea of Carl Jung's shadow. A lot of people think that when Carl Jung was talking about the shadow, he was strictly just giving another name to Freud's idea of the id, that animal side. But the shadow is something else. The shadow is our unconscious desires. It's our socially unaccepted thoughts and behaviors that we keep inside. And so what Carl Jung said is that what we need to do is we need to integrate our shadows in order to not fall into evil or treachery. There's 3 steps to this. The first step is recognition. So realizing that not only do you have a shadow, but figuring out what it is. What are your unconscious desires? The next step is acceptance. A lot of people reject this initial thought right away. We don't want to see the worst parts of ourselves. But Carl Jung said that we really have to accept that about ourselves. We can work on changing, but you have to accept it first. It's kind of like if your room is messy or your car is messy, you have to recognize that there's a problem there before you can clean it. You're not going to clean something that you don't think is messy. And the third step is integration. The third step is trying to integrate these undesirable characteristics or traits into positive ways, positive expressions. It's illustrated really well in Lord of the Flies. So I want to back up to the final chapter when Ralph discovers the Lord of the Flies, the pig skull on a stick. What does he do? He goes up to it and he punches it and he breaks the skull in half. And as you know, the Lord of the Flies is really supposed to represent the ultimate evil. A lot of people associate it with Beelzebub or the devil, but really it is supposed to represent the ultimate evil. And it makes Ralph feel sick and queasy and rageful. And so he breaks the skull in half. And what does he do next? He takes the stick that was holding it up, the spear that was sharpened at both ends, and now he uses it as a defensive tool. So we've got the 3 steps there. We've got recognition. Ralph sees the evil. Then we have acceptance. Ralph takes the stick and plans to use it. And then third, integration. He does use it as a defensive mechanism. And so it is a coming-of-age story where he learns about the darkness of man's heart, but he also has to come to terms with his own, because the only chance at survival he has by the end of the novel is to wield a weapon against boys that he once called friends. Finally, I just want to say thank you to whoever's still watching. I know that this is an absurdly long video, but I didn't really see too many long-form videos on Lord of the Flies, so I wanted to make one that went through the summary and analysis in a proper way. There's even more that I could say. It really depends on the teacher and who's talking about this book. Everybody's going to have a different interpretation. So if you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to leave a comment, and be sure to check out the next video where we do a deep dive on Infinite Jest. Thank you.